Kia ora, good morning. Could I call on our Deputy Mayor to open with karakia?
Tēnā koe, Mr Chair. O tira, tēnā tātou katoa, āmihi. Tū taua mai I runga, tū taua mai I raro, tū taua mai I roto, tū taua mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Ngā mihi, thank you for opening up our hui. Can I do some housekeeping first that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on our YouTube channel. Health and safety procedures are on the screen for fire and emergency. Hearing the alarm, we head to Te Marae o Hine, the square. Health and safety, non-smoking, defibrillators on the ground floor. Any incidences, report them to our administrators. Any online participants, please keep your cameras turned on, microphones muted. Please introduce yourself when you're presenting, and any amendments, please, just for us as members, if you want to email them to administrators, that would be helpful, particularly if you're attending online. So that's the housekeeping. Can I call on apologies? And we do have an apology from Councillor Johnson for late arrival. Are there any others? Councillor Finlay. Councillor Finlay to be included. Councillor Harper to fly. Yes.
Just if we get to 4 p.m, I've got a meeting I've got to go to, so early departure for 4 p.m.
Yep, okay. That is not my intention, but just so everyone can have a level of comfort. I'll move those apologies, seconded by Councillor Naylor, and invite a vote. That is passed unanimously, 14 votes for. Can I just mention two things at this point as far as an additional? There is a page which pertains to the quarterly report. It was circulated earlier, admittedly yesterday, but there's no need to receive that as a late item as my advice, but please note that as an additional attachment. And secondly, just in regards to the run sheet being circulated at indicative time, I feel like it's given a huge allowance for us to start even having items into the afternoon, and I'm not so sure we're going to need that entirely, so please don't use that as a goal. I'll be looking to bring forward items and using our time effectively. So they're just two there. So no additional items. 4, is there any declarations of interest? There have been none. Any public comment? There have been none. Can I move us to confirmation of the minutes? I'm happy to move the minutes of the 14th of August. Seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comments or amendments. There have been none. I'd like to take a vote for the minutes. That's passed, 13 votes for with 1 abstention. Moves us to item 7, which is the quarterly performance and finance report ending 30th of September. Invite Scott Manser, the Manager for Finance, and John Aitkins, Manager, Project Management Office, to present this item. Thank you.
Morena tātou. Pleasure to be here presenting the first quarter report under the recently adopted 2024-34 long-term plan. So the year has started well with council ending 0.4 of a million favourable to the 30th of September, and that's as a result of timing, particularly on our digital transformation program. It's expected that program will catch up and fully utilise its budget for the year. Something officers have already started noticing is that we're seeing some pressure on some of the similar budgets that we did last year, particularly power and gas in that utilities space. So we're going to monitor that very closely as the year progresses. With the transport funding that we've been discussing in the last 2 council meetings, that is also likely to cause some pressure on the capitalised remuneration budgets as well. So like the utilities, the senior management team are going to continue to monitor that as the year progresses and ensure that we take any action that needs to there. You'll see in this committee report we have a recommendation to council to adjust the overhead budgets as a result of the realignment that was brought into effect on 1 July. There's two main reasons for that change. The first is that new organisation structure that came in on 1 July moved where some teams were sitting in terms of the overhead model. And the second is that some overheads weren't allocating as correctly as we thought when setting the LTP. The biggest there was fleet and supply. So they weren't allocating based on a usage, they were allocating on a different driver. The example of resource recovery didn't receive a large share of the fleet, and obviously they have a large portion of the fleet. So we've corrected that as part of this as well. I'm certain there'll be some questions on that, so I'll probably wait to there. Otherwise, I'll pass over to John to speak to the capital.
Kia ora tātou katoa, ko John Aiken taku ingoa. I'm the manager of the Project Management Office. In terms of the capital delivery report, we've been off to a good start, largely in the capital delivery space. However, towards the third month of the first quarter, we're seeing variance start to creep in, which equates to 3.2 million year to date, largely in the capital new space. There's a few reasons for this. Two of them are on page 6 there that relate to the Amberley Avenue Bridge design and build, relating to resource consent and adhering to conditions there. The second one there is the Totara Road wastewater treatment plant earthquake strengthening. These are the anaerobic digesters and the earthquake strengthening of that. We've delivered one of 3 work packages there to stabilise the tanks themselves. The second is out for procurement at the moment, and the third is underway in terms of design. It's a very complex undertaking that needs to be done with due diligence and care. The other aspect I'd like to raise to everyone's attention here is relation to the weather in August. So those that spend a lot of time outside would have noticed there was quite a large amount of precipitation, which did preclude a lot of work being done throughout the month of August, which has affected, particularly in the capital news space. And that's it for the capital delivery report. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yep, open it up for questions, members. So, Q, if you have queries. Councillor Wood.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one small question from me on page 71. This is about the program from the bottom. Program's up. 1711 industrial growth, Longburn industrial wastewater. There's $109,000 of unbudgeted expenditure there. Was that a carry forward from last year, or was did an issue occur that led to that much unbudgeted expenditure?
In answer to the first part of the question, no, it wasn't a carry forward. What happened here was the depot team did a job out at Longburn. I believe it was a pumping wastewater job that was completed earlier in the year. It was declared a savings, and as part of the CE delegation, we moved some of that budget around in the previous financial year, and there was some paperwork that was missing to be delivered through. So officers are just working to correct that error and find some savings within another program to offset that, given there's no budget.
Makes sense. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
I think you've got me.
Oh, okay. Councillor Naylor, I'll come to you next, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple from me. I note the remuneration actual is above budget, and just looking at page 32, just trying to understand what's driving that. The FTE appears to be more than the budgeted FTE, but then that also includes vacancies. So I'm just trying to understand why the actual is above budget.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you'll remember a couple of times this calendar year. The first was through the LTP, where we moved the capitalised remuneration portion of the budget into the remuneration line. We did the same thing through our annual report, where we had to correct previous year's statements. That unfavourable variance is a result of the capitalised labour not quite tracking according to plan through the wet weather, the transport program getting off to a slower start with the lack of certainty around funding. So that's the reason why we're 200,000 over budget there, whilst we are still carrying those vacancies.
Okay, thank you. And just my second question relates to Appendix 4, Attachment 4, on page 79, and, you know, the change to those budgets. I'm just mindful that we had, you know, there were at least a couple of shift arounds during the LTP process, which made it quite hard for sort of budgeting and trying to actually see where the true increases were. Will this be the last time that this changes? And also, what will this mean for our current year's annual budget in terms of tracking to annual budget?
Yes, this will be the last time the overheads will change for the current financial year. So there's a no increase to that budget there, as you can see by the zero at the bottom of page 79. This has arisen as a bit of a consequence of changing financial system, budgeting model, and trying to do an LTP all in a very short space. Compounded with that was the change in the organisation structure and where some teams were sitting. So we actually had a team come out of infrastructure and into corporate services, and that's impacted how the overheads work. We are currently reviewing and ensuring that the overhead model is working for the annual budget as part of next month's council paper. And in fact, I was at the senior lead team yesterday with some of those updates. So the checks and errors that we've found through here, we've reflected into the upcoming annual budget so that it's right and working as expected.
Okay, thank you. But my question more relates to the current year's annual budget. And so we've got, you know, year one of the LTP, and now so will we be tracking against the revised budget with these changes as opposed to tracking against the year one of LTP?
Yeah, so the quarterly report always reports against the revised budget, which will include these changes. Our annual report will report against the adopted LTP, so there will be some variances that we'll have to explain as we get to that stage, but the quarterly reporting will always be against the revised budget.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Mayor.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Probably John, to you. Just thanks for your update, but just on a couple of things. Amberley Ave Bridge, all just briefly update. Going okay?
It's going slower than anticipated. Part of the reason around the delays relate to resource consent conditions and the requirement for a period of dry weather before you work above a waterway. It is a design and build project, so that means that it's all under contract, it's all underway. Piling has been installed, and that we trust that the project will be completed this financial year. It's just making sure that we've got clear weather and we've got the contractor on board to deliver that bridge.
And our favourite child, Pioneer Highway?
Yes, Pioneer Highway, the remaining work left with Pioneer Highway is to reseal the tar seal that was put down as an interim measure. So the road's opened up in full access into the Pioneer Plaza car park. We are working with the contractor for that particular project. They've faced issues around their asphalt plant and availability of asphalt, so we've escalated this issue and we're working with them to deliver this as expediently as possible.
Yeah, just sooner rather than later would be good. Just I'm thinking of the Christmas traffic and everything else.
Yes, of course. And the other piece with this is all future works will be done at night rather than during the day, disrupting businesses in and around that area.
Good. Thanks, Mr Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Zeba Bellin.
Thanks, Mr Chair. I had just 3 questions of clarification. One's on page 37 in the performance measures there for economic development measure number 1, relating to our need to have infrastructure ready sections to meet the NPSUD requirements. And we say that we have a sufficient 3-year supply, but industry is saying maybe that we haven't. So can you help me reconcile that difference? Do we have a set methodology we must use, and it's sort of a perception versus data kind of thing?
I might pass that one over to David Murphy.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. David Murphy, General Manager, Strategic Planning. Yeah, there is a set methodology, but we're continually, I guess, through both the consents team and the policy planning team engaging with the sector. Certainly the indications are that there's a shortage of, as we've indicated, shortage of small to medium-sized industrial properties in the city at the moment. But there is a piece of work in the city planning work program to look at a review of the industrial zone, and we've already started some conversations with some key players and landowners to look to address that.
Thank you, that's really helpful. My second question is on the same page for Measure 4, which is a description of the economic impact of some events that we've had, and I wanted to know how we were quantifying that. What's our methodology for that?
I'm looking to the table behind you, but I'm not sure who's going to take that question.
Kia ora, Danelle Whakatahi, General Manager, Customer and Community. The team use a particular tool. It's not coming to my head at the moment, but once I've got the name of that tool, I can send that out to you.
Oh, thank you very much. And my last question is about the footpath ratings, which is on page 40, Transport Measure 5. And notice that we are up slightly from last quarter. Have we seen a movement from some that were graded as poor move up to average? What can account for the improvement?
I'll pass that one to Glenn.
Glenn O'Connor, Transport Manager. The Movement Councillor incorporates any additional footpaths that we've done in the subsequent periods since the last report.
Cool, thank you. And is our reinstated budget sufficient to get us back to that 93%, or are we sort of treading water in the poor to average category until the funding environment shifts?
Very much the later. It's fair to say we'll be treading water until the funding environment shifts.
Great. Thank you. That's all from me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two questions for me. One for John. Just one about your project management tool. Just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit more about the tool.
Yes, certainly. So we've implemented a new software tool that is bedded into a software called ServiceNow, and this allows us to track scope, schedule, risk, and any issues, as well as reporting on finance. What we've seen is a strong uptake by our project managers and all those that deliver projects, and it's given us a greater level of visibility in terms of how projects are tracking and how projects are reported. So it is really a step change in terms of where we're at in terms of project delivery.
So will we see a little bit more than just what we're seeing on the page in terms of capital project delivery, rather than just the little bit that we're seeing on the page here today?
So in terms of comprehensiveness of the report, is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is potential to add to that as we're building on it. The tool came into effect in earnest on the 1st of July.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the first quarter that we've actually used it, and after every month end iteration, we're finding further refinements and improvements as we go. So certainly we can look to add to the capital delivery report.
My second question probably is for Jeff. I'm going to talk about consents. So I'm on page 34. So we are at 71% and we were at 52%. So how can we get to 100% resource consents? Page 34. When will that happen?
Kia ora koutou.
What the auditor wants as well.
Jeff Baker, Planning Services Manager. The KPI is 80% for consents on time. That used to be 95%. That was unrealistic for a variety of reasons. A lot of them are outside of our direct control. So our focus this year is to try and get as close to 80% as possible. We had a good bump in that first quarter, 20% above what we achieved for last year. And in the circumstances, that's a great result because we're short on staff. I think the answer is much the same as one I've probably given to Councillor Wood around that it being probably unrealistic that 100% is achievable. So I'm certainly not able to promise that, but what we're doing is taking steps to get a much better result than we have done in previous years.
So in terms of communicating that to customers and developers, so they realise that it's only 80% rather than 100%?
There's been no direct communication to developers on that point. I mean, it is available on public records, but we haven't publicised that point. I mean, our focus at the moment is really just trying to get the actions done to get as close to the 80% at this stage.
Okay. A drop of this.
Sorry.
Drop in levels to 80%?
Actually, it's an increase in level of service in terms of what we have been performing to. I think the 80% is a realistic marker for the complexities of dealing with resource consents. We weren't able to achieve or even get close to 95%. We've got a KPI that's a lot more achievable, we believe, with the changes we're making over the next 18 months.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you. I might just follow up on that, Jeff. My understanding of the ability to meet timeliness around consents is a combination of factors, only some of which are in council's direct control. Would that be a fair comment?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Couple questions left on my list. I guess the first one's project specific, around in the transport space. Just interested how we're getting on now with bus shelter placements on the new bus routes, and specifically been getting some feedback around Main Street East, so between city centre and say Terrace End, heading out of the city.
I'll defer to Glenn O'Connor, the Manager of Transport. For
Great,
this
thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. The Main Street bus stops that you reference aren't on a current work plan. I want to say maybe 5, 6 or 7 stops are quite complex stops from memory. I think we've got the Rose Garden and the Curb and Channel Gardens behind. There isn't concrete pads available. The office's intent will be to bring packages such as that to the next long-term plan process for substantial bits of work. The current funding that we have allows 1 or 2 new bus stops, but certainly not the extensive amounts that you mentioned.
So the message to the community is 3 years minimum standing in mud and rose prickles? Question mark?
Yes, it's currently not on the work program, so pretty much what we see is what we get until we have additional funding.
Can I understand how we ended up in a situation where some of the extremities of the network, I'm thinking of Pacific Drive, I'm thinking of Ruahine Street, have quite comprehensive treatment with very nice new shelters, but some of the core spines of the network haven't been touched yet and are now looking at 3 years of being untouched?
I'm not familiar with the specifics of how the sites were ranked and chosen, but as a broad statement, the intent, as I know, was to continue installing new and improved bus stops throughout our city. with the change in funding, there is no longer the funding to be able to provide those new and improved stops out on the streets.
I'll just add to that if I can. So the passenger trains or the public transport project looked to prioritise those new bus stops because under the Horizons change to the routes, we were looking at the what would class as capital new or the new bus stops to facilitate those routes as a priority. The subsequent priority or the second priority to that was renewing our existing stops and decommissioning stops that were no longer required with Horizons changing the route. So the logic behind it wasn't around the dilapidation of any bus stops or the level of service. It was around adherence to the new routes coming into effect earlier this year.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for those answers. That's appreciated. Just a couple further questions, Chair, around some of the KPIs. This is kind of a new KPI set. So I was just interested, is there a general intent where we have kind of year-on-year or trend data to include that? We have some kind of context around what's happening on a quarterly basis?
I'm probably not best to answer that, so I might look to David Murphy to talk to that, given we have a vacancy for that long-term planner manager role.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, David Murphy, General Manager, Strategic Planning. That's certainly something we can take on note. As Scott said, we're in the process of finalising some changes around the sort of LTP and organisational performance function within the organisation. That's coming to SLT shortly. We anticipate that function will look closely at the quarterly report and work alongside Scott and the team, but that's something we can take on note as part of that work going forward.
Great, thank you. The other question is specific around housing measure 4, which is on page 35. The comment there is sufficiently generic that I think it could fit any quarter of the decade. Is there a way that this measure could be, or do staff intend to refine it in a way so we can get a picture of what's happening within the quarter in terms of diversity of housing typology?
Again, through you, Mr. Chair, just to clarify, would that be in terms of the diversity of dwellings that have been delivered, or the diversity of dwellings that we'd sort of seek to achieve?
More around delivery.
Yeah, again, we can take that on notice. A lot of that depends on I think the quality of the data that we're receiving. But again, I can talk to the team and look at whether or not that can be included.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. I've got a series of questions. So, in no particular order, page 42, the swimming numbers, there's been a significant decrease in the number of people swimming at Freiburg, I think reduction of 19%. Do we have any kind of insight into why that is?
I'm getting a shake of the head from Glenn, but I don't think we have the right officer here to answer.
Glenn O'Connor, acting GM in this infrastructure in this situation, will confirm that answer to that question, Councillor.
Okay, thank you. I'm interested just generally to know if, and I don't think there is, but I may have missed it, if there's anywhere in the report where we compare how much we're having to spend on reactive repairs versus planned maintenance and renewal, and if there isn't, if we could have some kind of comparison stroke ratio so we can see how we're tracking if the spend on reactive repairs is increasing versus the regular spend on maintenance renewals.
I might start with that and look to some help from Glenn potentially as well. That's a very hard piece of information to track. Reactive and maintenance budgets are embedded right across the organisation in a in a wide manner of budgets, and they're not necessarily always called maintenance budgets. And we can, officers under delegation can choose to spend against a different line item, for example, and advice a consultant, for example, to do some of that reactive maintenance. So it's very hard for us to actually be able to track repairs and maintenance budgets compared to renewals. We have really good data on the renewals. As you know, they're a separate program, but trying to track repairs and maintenance across the organisation is much more difficult because of the wide variety of budgets through the organisation.
So you wouldn't be able to give us a figure for unplanned repairs and maintenance?
Not easily, no. Where there is unplanned maintenance, we would potentially require officers to set up a new project code, and that brings a whole lot of administration over the top of things as well.
Okay, I think there's some indication that Glenn wants to have a word.
One thing we could consider and look at, Councillor, would be the trend in service requests. And if I looked at potholes, for example, we could look and see the correlation potentially between the amount of reseals and rehab we're doing with service requests for potholes. So something to look at. Reiterating a bit of what Scott said, it is very hard. I think John earlier alluded to the incredibly wet August we had. And we had lots of potholes in August because of the rain, and that's not necessarily a correlation between poor or lack of surfacing, for argument's sake, but certainly something we'll look at and we'll consider.
Okay, I'll leave that there for now. I'll leave that thought with you. Okay, moving on to vacancies. Are we holding any vacancies, or are the vacancies all live and as a result of current turnover, if you know what I mean?
I'll pass that one over to Danelle.
Kia ora anō. Through the chair, most of them are ones that we have going to be recruiting for. There are only several that are on hold that we're just looking at how those roles are shaped up and what we need for the organisation. And a really good example of that is the long-term plan manager role that's come up that David just alluded to before.
So when we're hearing, which we have heard from different departments, that there's pressure on staffing, is that because we can't find people to recruit, or we're not actively recruiting in those areas? So just a current example would be, say, the consents team, where we just heard that there was pressure there.
So we're absolutely having no issue recruiting. In fact, our numbers for applications coming in are quite extensive, and we are currently recruiting for that particular team. So there's no issue with that. It's people are getting the requests through to SLT quite quickly, and we're able to approve them to go and recruit.
Okay, thank you. Are there any measures being taken at the moment that we might not be aware of, I suppose, to hold down operational spending? So budgets on hold, staff positions on hold, that kind of thing.
That's a really good question. And in fact, just this week, I've asked on behalf of SLT for the budget holders across the organisation to start some year-end forecasting, so that we can get some information back to SLT so they can make potential decisions such as hold budgets or vacancies to monitor that end-of-year forecast. Unfortunately, you weren't in the room for my introduction, but there are a couple of budget lines that are already starting to see some pressures, same as last year, power and gas being the predominant ones. So that year-end forecasting is in line with assisting Wade and his team to make some decisions around the performance operationally for the council.
Okay, so if that is necessary, could that be reported on through the quarterly financial report?
I don't see any reason why not. It would go through the SLT team first, but I don't see any reason why we can't put some of those forecasting figures there.
Okay, thank you. And then just last question, on page 77, there's a notification of a reallocation of budget in the community support budget. So money moving from the new community hubs programme to community centres Pacifica Centre expansion. Can I just have a comment on why that's necessary and what the consequence of that would be on the new community hubs programme?
I can probably start with that answer, and hopefully I'm correct in this. The Pacifica Centre expansion is a build in year 2 of the LTP, and in year 1 there was no design budget. So this reallocation is for moving design costs to enable that Pacifica Centre expansion to progress. As part of this, what we need to do through the annual budget is actually move that 400,000 back. So the two programs are the same cost across the LTP. It's just the annual allocation is slightly different. So the community hubs has $1 million in this current year. They're just going to design so that we the 600,000 budget as a result of this transfer, and then as part of the annual budget process, we'll look to move that back and ensure that the two budgets against the two programs are the same.
Right. So so it's not a permanent loss to community hubs. It's just a lending to Pacifica for a year, and then they'll get it back.
It's a very good way of putting it. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thanks,
Councillor
Mr. Chair.
Johnson, the officers here now that could maybe respond to
answer
the
the swimming?
swimming.
Yeah.
If you would like to re-put that.
Okay, I'll just put the swimming question again. So page 42, the swimming numbers for Freiburg are down quite a lot this year, and I wondered if we had any insight into why that is.
Kathy Deaver-Todd, Manager Parks and Reserves. We have noticed since COVID, we've tended to have a lot more fluctuation in our pool numbers between quarters, but generally they've ended up about the same at the end of the year. So we have had a particularly cold spring, and it's likely that this has impacted on the Freiburg. One of the things about the Freiburg pool compared to the other pools is the number of groups and group bookings that use it, and that tends to be schools. So this could be just a movement of the timing of when a school group is doing its swimming programs. But in general, we found over the years that Freiburg is pretty well evened out. There's nothing in the reports from CLM that suggests this is anything more than a seasonal raw booking thing.
Thank you very much for that. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief, could I ask a question about resource consent, please?
Kia ora, Jeff Baker, Planning Services Manager.
Thanks, Jeff. Won't keep you on. Just to follow on from Councillor Harper's earlier question, I was just trying to find on the City Council website the description of statutory timeframes. Can we understand what that timeframe looks like or what it is?
It's a bit variable. Typically, it's 20 working days for a bog standard resource consent. Yeah, it's around about 20 working days. There are different timeframes for different things. If it was a large notified consent, the timeframe gets the statutory timeframes are extended. But by and large, for most members of the public, 20 working days is the 20 working days is the figure in mind.
For sure. Jeff, would you agree that the public would understand that if an RFI comes in or is generated from a resource consent application, does the 20 working days restart?
Yeah, we always include written communication which explains that if there's an RFI or a Section 92 in my world, that the clock has stopped. Typically, most resource consents come through agents, whether they're planners or surveyors, and they're well versed on the working days calculation.
So the statutory timeframes that are reported in today's report includes RFI timeframes that get pushed out as a result?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it's the accurate cost, including all stop the clock stoppages through the process. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks. That's all I have. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question's on page 24, back to Amberley Avenue. It says here this financial year. Do we have a month or a bit closer date? You really wanted that,
No. This project's particularly well, because of the resource consent and the requirements to have a period of fine weather for work to occur over the waterway, that's when it's you know, the schedule is planned for July 2025. However, advance faster than that should we get a period of fine weather over summer, or if it's a wet summer, it could extend right the way through to July 2025.
Okay, thanks for that. My second question is communication with the community in that area. Has that been done?
Yes, my project managers have been out on site, knocking on doors, informing people, as well as completing what we call dilapidation surveys to conduct a condition assessment on properties. So when the pile drilling occurs and any potential damage is observed, we've got a pre-start record of what the existing condition of properties around that area is. And we do have ongoing stakeholder communication with the residents in the nearby area.
Okay, so they know it's planned for this financial year?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks both. Hello. My question's about the funding update, noting that you say 3.5 million funding approved and drawn down, or approved and not yet claimed, primarily through Better Off funding. So that's 75%. How much of the funding that we've secured isn't Better Off funding?
That would be the balance of what we've secured, if that makes sense, because Better Off funding is only one of the external funding sources that we're tapping into in the current year. So anything else that we've secured that's not Better Off funding would be the balance of that figure. That's probably not the best answer.
No, what is the balance of that figure, Scott?
I might have to go away and come back to you with that answer.
Okay. So in that funding area, I mean, it's quite worrying, the green and the blue Better Off funding. If we've got 20% missing funding, which is where we're at the moment, recognising we're early in the year, which programmes are at risk and when will we have a go, no-go report on those?
My understanding from the resolution as part of the long-term plan is that they would be no-go until funding is secured.
When are there any where that is becoming imminent?
Would have to go away and have a look at exactly what programs are in there. If officers felt that we should bring something back to committee for those, or council for those ones, we would do that. Cam.
Yeah, through Mr. Chair. I'm not aware of any at the top of mind at the moment that are at a no-go stage. In terms of the mix of funding and that sort of thing, you'll be possibly aware of the Regional Infrastructure Fund as an additional fund that was announced this year. We have an application in for that for Te Mautau, which is a significant amount of the external funding required in the current or early part of the long-term plan. So that's been submitted. But there is a number of there's quite a bit of investigative work to occur in this space. And there's also a bit of a funding strategy, because you'll know some of the known funders, your regular trusts and other types of funders, there is limitations as to what you can apply for or how often you can apply for it. So we're trying to make sure we're being coordinated in the sense that we maximise those opportunities.
Thanks, Cam. Appreciate that comment. I'm probably just signalling this is an area where I'll be interested to see that coming through in quarterly reports. It's a change to our process and we have some risk there. And then a final question was about, there's a comment just in that funding update about events approved in the LTP with 100% council funding, but they have the potential to secure external funding. And the examples given are in our events calendar Question is, if we are successful in attracting external funding for those events, does that decrease the budget or increase the service?
Good question, Councillor. My view is that the council has approved to deliver a certain thing, and that is what the budget is there for. And in terms of funding applications, it would first of all, we're seeking to offset the cost for ratepayers. There are occasions where I suspect there are occasions that there are opportunities where perhaps it can add to the service that you wouldn't otherwise have been able to achieve, and that's the only thing that the funder would approve. So I don't think there is a singular answer, but if I think of our order of priority, it's to try and deliver what is agreed in the long-term plan at the best value for ratepayers. So we're trying to use those funds to reduce the ratepayer implications.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just one further quick question. Under the funding update, you've mentioned the Regional Infrastructure Fund application for Te Mautoa Poutoa that's been submitted, and I'm just wondering if we know what the decision date is for that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, we don't have a date at this point in time that I can give you. I believe as soon as I'm able to give you an update on that, I will. But it's in process at the moment, and they haven't given us a specific date that they would let us know by.
Okay.
If I could just chip in, I believe it's circa March 2025.
March. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. There's no further questions. I appreciate you presenting this item. I'm happy to move the recommendations both before us, seconded by Councillor Naylor, that the committee receive the memorandum titled Quarterly Performance and Finance Report, 30th of September, relating attachments, and presented to the Strategy and Finance Committee 13th of November. And 2, that the council approve the adjustments to activities due to the internal realignment per attachment 4, realignment budgets variation. Open it up for any comments or debate. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Look, I know this is already a very comprehensive report and it gives us a lot of information, but I'm feeling that there's more information that would be useful to put in it. And one of those things is around trends and absolute costs of repairs that are unplanned, that need to be done because something fails. And I think that that's important because in the heat of the long-term plan, we were very, very tight on some of the budgets in terms of renewals and in terms of maintenance programs. And I think it's important that we keep a really close eye going forward on whether those budgets are actually adequate, or whether we have unintentionally created more expense for ourselves rather than a saving by cutting back on renewals and maintenance in some areas, and therefore ending up spending more on reactive repairs. So I think it would be really useful, I understand it's a bit tricky, but it'd be really useful if we could have some kind of eye over that, trends over time, so that we can, particularly going into the next budget discussion, we can be clear whether or not we've got those budgets at the right level, because it can look like a saving to reduce a renewals budget or a maintenance budget, but if ultimately it results in you having to put more money in to do reactive repairs, then it's quite the opposite of a saving. It's actually an expense. So I would like some oversight on that if we can get it. And the other thing I'm interested in knowing about is whether or not different departments are needing to put in measures to control operational expenditure that would result perhaps in a loss of service or a reduction in service that is an unanticipated control on operational spending in order to bring the budget into a neutral or a surplus budget. And the reason I'm interested in that is, again, it speaks to how much budget we assign on an annual basis for different departments. And if those budgets are inadequate, but yet we're not seeing that through reporting that, oh, well, actually, we're having to hold X number of vacancies open, or actually we're having to put this type of maintenance work on hold to control costs, then I think we're not getting a realistic view of what things are costing and what service levels are being impacted. And again, it speaks to budget decisions that have to be made, and it seems to be the trend for some members of council to want to be reducing operational and renewal budgets. And I'm concerned that if that goes too far, we see real impacts and they're not being reported on. So I really would encourage, as far as staff are able to, some reporting on those two matters to be included in the future quarterly financial report, so that we're clear as the year goes on what the impact of those budgets is, and if it's not achieving what we intended, then that's also clear for helping decision making going forward. So that's my comments. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Hapata.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of comments from me. One's about the project management tool. It was really exciting to see that, and great to see John present that to us today, but I'd kind of like to see a little bit more. It's great to see something that's in action. I know it's only been going since the 1st of July, but it'd be good to see a little bit more from the tool in terms of reporting. So I'd like to see maybe in the next report that we see a little bit more from it in terms of the issues that are coming out of the projects, in terms of what we can actually see from a transparency point of view for the capital projects. So it'd be good to see that for the next report. And the second thing is around consents. Just the auditor did bring this up to our attention, that it was one of our biggest things, and maybe we need a dashboard around this. Maybe we need something around it that shows us that we've got to have this as a target that's right centre in front of us, that shows it. We have to have this more, that this has got to be something that we've really got to keep a real close eye on. So I just think the consents is something that we've got to keep it right front and centre and keep on it the whole time. So I'm not going to stop going on about it.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick comments. Firstly, around the new KPI set that we have with the new long-term plan, I really think that's off to a really good start, actually seeing the quality reporting in there, the information. A few gaps where we could pick up some trends over time, some more specificity in quarters, probably iron out some of the plain language side of it occasionally, but overall it's off to a really good start, and so I wanted to thank officers for the work put into that space. Second point and final that I wanted to comment on was specifically around the bus stops or lack of shelters on Main Street East, and it is a bit concerning. So passing on some constituent feedback, constituents that used to rely and use the Terrace Inn shops through the bus going on Broadway, fantastic shelters there. They're now standing by the side of the road, trying to find their way to a bus in Main Street, and to hear that there's 3 years of waiting there unsheltered isn't very satisfactory, especially when we have much less used parts of the network that have quite nice new shelters. So there's 5 bus lines that go up and down that route. No shelters for 3 years. That's a pretty poor start to getting uptake of a new system, especially when we're facing the lack of access to Terrace Inn via Broadway. So just putting it out there that's an unfortunate consequence of the way that planning and prioritizations happen. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you. There's no further speakers wishing to make comments, so I'd now like to invite a vote. That is passed unanimously, 15 votes for. That brings us to item number 8, which is the Treasury Report, quarter ending 30th of September, and invite Steve Patterson, the Manager of Finance and Strategy, to come forward to present. Thank you, Steve.
Good morning, elected members. The report this month's
pretty straightforward from my perspective, and nothing particular to draw to your attention. The sums we've drawn, the cost of what we've incurred in terms of interest, and the way in which the portfolio has been managed are in accordance with the policies and practices that we have. So respond to any questions if you have any.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Steve. Just wanted to ask, with the OCR dropping quite quickly at the moment, whether you think we might be over-hedged and that we need to have maybe more on the sort of kind of floating, if you know what I mean, as opposed to the swaps?
We've been looking at the policy for that and haven't hedged anything more during the course of this period. We had planned to hedge a little bit more over the last couple of weeks, but haven't done so. So we're within the policy parameters at the moment, and just monitoring that as the interest rates change. So I don't think we're overhedged. No, we're at a bit over 50% there at the moment.
Okay, but at the moment you're not hedging any more, given that we might even be expecting a further movement at the end of the month?
In terms of the interest rates at the moment, our hedging is protecting us. Interest rates, you're right, are reducing a bit. The OCR is. But if we were out borrowing in the market today, for example, for 5-year bonds, which is about the normal term that we'd borrow for, the basic rate plus the margin, we'd be able to borrow for about 5.3% or a bit over. Okay. So that's still higher than what our average cost of borrowing is that we've budgeted for at the moment.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. My question relates to the chart on top of page 83 under 3.5, which shows the net debt and the change, which the $21.2 million change to the net debt. This is quite a bit more than in the previous report. We were told that capital new and growth was about 7.1 million for the first quarter, and so I'm just wanting to understand how come our net debt has increased by 21 million in the first quarter, whilst we're only, you know, our overall capital spend is quite a lot less than that, particularly in the new and growth area.
Yes. Yes, Councillor, there was an issue around timing of the raising of some of the debt in that period. We effectively had some cash sitting on hand right at the end of the month of nearly 13 million, which, if you took that into account, would have meant that the debt would have been down nearer the level that you would expect for the amount of capital. It just happened that during the month we needed to raise money because of timing. It was particularly in August, the timing of when things were going out, and so that's been now countered by having the cash available a little bit earlier than what we'd originally planned. So.
Okay, thank you. And just recalling, thinking back to the year-end, the report that we got back in August, and the year-end debt was actually ahead of the revised budget by about 6.9 million. And at the time, it was said that was due to receivables owing on the 30th of June. And I'm just wondering, I would have expected that would have had an impact on this first quarter if that was all settled in that time. What is the impact of that? What was owing?
So those receivables have been settled since then, and I guess it just depends on the timing of the programs that were particularly being funded during that first quarter. But I think that broadly, the sum we've raised and where we've ended up is in accordance with what we'd expect.
Sorry, I can't quite hear you.
The position we've ended up with is about what I would have expected given the timing of the programs that we've had and the work that we've done and the timing of our cash flows during that period, because as you're aware, the debt's a mixture of funding capital programs and our day-to-day cash requirements, and sometimes there are timing issues around that influence what we've got on a particular day.
Okay, thank you. Just my last question relates to the graph that's on the bottom half of that page, showing how it tracks. Now, I note that up till the June 2022, there's one bar for each year, and then after that, there's one bar for each month. So the scale sort of distorts the picture. I'm just wondering if there's a better way to look at that, because at a first glance it looks like it's quite flat through the last couple of years, but then I realised that it's a month, each month as compared to the first half of the gap is a whole year for each interval.
Well, I decided to do it this way because I thought, looking back a few years, you could see what the annual position was, but to give you a more detailed picture of monthly was just the way I chose to do it. If you think that's distorting the position, I can look at another way of doing it, but for the moment I think that gives you a broad picture of a long-term position and then a more detailed picture of the last couple of years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. No further questions. Thank you, Steve, for presenting this item. I'm happy to move the recommendation before us that the committee note the performance of Council Treasury activity for the quarter ending 30th September 24, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comments or debate. Councillor Naylor, floor's yours.
Yeah, thank you. It's been good to have those questions answered, and certainly at a first glance it appeared to me where we're drawing down 61% of the debt for the year, but only delivering 13%, and our net debt has, we've used about 30% of we're going to borrow for this. So after the way that the year is an area to keep a close eye on to ensure that we don't use more debt than what we budget for. But I'm assured by the questions to those, the answers to those questions that, given the fact that that cash is sitting in the bank, that we should be tracking okay. So I'll be watching this in the coming reports, but comfortable with where things are at.
Great, thank you. No further speakers in the queue, so now I'd like to invite a vote. That's passed unanimously, 15 votes for. That brings us to item 9, local water done well, funding reallocation. Invite Scott Manser, our Manager for Finance, and Julie Keane, our Transition Manager, forward to present this item.
Morning again. Going to take this paper largely as read. Just want to talk to a couple of minor points. So this is a reallocation of funding sources, not a change in the budgets, which was sort of alluded to in the quarter report paper a little bit ago. It's in line with the letter that we received from the Minister of Local Government back in April 2024 around what we can use the transition funding for. The ability to do this funding reallocation has been achieved through Mike's team with a really good tendering and procurement process and a signed contract that we've been able to lock in these savings. So that's some excellent work by the officers involved in that process. It is subject to DIA approval, however we have already had some indication that this is very likely to be approved. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Now I go to Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the report. So, just to be clear, this won't have any impact on the Ashes water quality work?
Correct. This is a funding allocation, not a budget change.
Okay, thank you. Just thought we'd get that nice and clear.
Thank you. Councillor Zebulon. Oh, you come out? No further questions. Thank you both. I'll move the tranche of recommendations. I'm not intending to read each one, save you the pain, but you've had them in your report. They're the same on the screen. Look for a seconder, Councillor Naylor, and open it up for any comments or debate. There being none, I'd now like to invite a vote. That's passed unanimously. That's 15 votes for. Councillors, we'll now take our morning adjournment for 15 minutes and come back into the chamber at 25 past. Thank you. Ferguson Pye, the City Planning Manager, Sarah Jenkins, the Consultation Planner, and Dave Charnley, the Senior Urban Designer. I mentioned the consultant for the consultation. Thank you very much for the drop-in sessions that you made available to members to get an overview on this item. But the floor is yours for the presentation and your comments. Thank you. Also, just for everyone here, we've had a request if we can speak further closer into the mics, just for the volume in the chamber, for the quality of hearing. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Kia ora koutou. Morning, everybody. Morning to the Chair, the Mayor and Deputy Mayor. Look, we're here to talk to PCI and seek your approval for public notification of the plan change under the first schedule of the Resource Management Act. Just before we get started, we do have a brief presentation, but there's just a couple of other matters I'd just like to talk to first. Firstly, I'd just like to introduce Sarah Jenkins. Sarah is the lead planner on this plan change. She's been working with Simon Morey, our principal planner, in the development of the plan change. Sarah has worked with us in the past. She was in this chamber last year, I think, talking to the Te Utanganui master plan. So hopefully she's been in the chamber before. Also, we've got a number of colleagues in the chamber who drafted some of the technical assessments for the plan change. So if any of the questions sort of get detailed in nature, we have Reiko Broham, who developed the stormwater assessment, Aaron Phillips, Stacey Andrews, who developed our economic assessment, David Watson, climate change, Dave Charnley, who's with us here for landscape, but as discussed, Dave has also developed a 3D model of the provision, so potentially some of the questions might be easier to answer through visual medium rather than a verbal description. And we also have Nick Jesson here from CR Law, who undertook the legal review of the technical assessments and the Section 32 assessment. Before I ask Sarah to dive into the presentation, just a little bit of a strategic context to describe sort of how this plan change fits within that broader strategic area. Obviously, we have a growing city, and under the NPSUD, we're required and have obligations to provide for that growth. We know with upcoming resource management reform that those obligations are only going to grow in terms of being responsive to growth. Some of the signals are that there's going to have to be a 30-year supply of residential land, and the government have talked about live zoning. So it'll be interesting to see what live zoning actually means for councils when that legislation proceeds next year. I guess I've talked to this a few times in the last 18 months in a number of reports, and I have in this one, is that we are a large provincial city and we are transitioning towards being a small metropolitan over the next 10 or 15 years. I think when we think about that transition, and then we also think about the vision of the LTP, which is small city benefits, big city ambition, I think we need to think about the tension that is inherently in that vision, which is how do we grow the city in a way that maintains the benefits that we all enjoy living in a provincial city. And I think what PCI tries to do there is, in terms of that tension and resolving that tension, it lays a sort of an accessibility lens over that tension. So it essentially says we're going to grow the city, but we're going to grow the city in a way that we have good accessibility to employment nodes, open green space, public transport, active transport, schools, business centres. So that's sort of how PCI sort of fits within that broader strategic context. We know that land supply continues to be constrained in the city, in particular greenfield development. We know through the LTP that we no longer have funding for the growth programs in our DC policy to fund at the moment those growth areas, and that'll be a challenge for us in the future. And we need to think about what the options for growth are, and certainly keeping options open is going to be important in the future. And I think we had that conversation with the community through the FDS, where we had a number of options that we talked to the community about how we could provide for growth in the city. So PCI really is a response in part to the FDS as well. Just lastly, I came to council in August with a 3-year work program, and in part that report was in response to some frustration that the development community had around multi-unit housing, and we said that this plan change would be trying to simplify that approach, and so this plan change is a response to that commitment that we made in August. We've also talked about trying to use our consultancy budget more constructively and get better value out of it, and certainly we've tried to use more internal resource to develop the technical reports for this plan change. I think what that's probably doing is hopefully building some internal capability within the organisation to do a bit more of this work, and it also, I think, is meaning that we're developing this plan change certainly in a more cost-effective manner than we potentially have done in the past. So just setting the scene there, but I'll hand over to Sarah and we will talk through the presentation before we answer questions.
Tēnā tātou katoa, ko Sarah Jenkins tōku ingoa. Thank you for the opportunity to present Plan Change I. There is a presentation, yes, and I need to keep pushing that and push that. Sorry. Right. So the presentation takes you through a little bit of context and then lays out a little bit of the detail as well of the plan change. So national direction requires a number of things from the council. The policy statement for urban development requires council to provide sufficient development capacity to enable heights and densities, to have regard to its own future development strategy, and to implement this plan change. The National Policy Statement for Freshwater requires the council to avoid, remedy or mitigate the adverse effects of urban development on freshwater. There are some requirements in the National Planning Standards, and the Resource Management Act requires management of significant risk of natural hazards. What the RMA does not require is adoption of the medium density residential standards. And so the opportunity for council is really to think about what is the right set of standards for Palmerston North, as opposed to being forced to adopt the national set like the Tier 1 authorities have been. So, purpose of the plan change, why are we doing what we're doing? We're rezoning over 800 hectares, proposed to rezone over 800 hectares of the urban area where there is good accessibility, so that we can get more housing. Does a little bit what it says on the tin, increasing housing supply and choice. We're enabling development capacity in the medium term, so this goes to the council's housing and business needs assessment, so from about 2026 onwards. We're responding to developer feedback on the operative multi-unit housing area provisions, doing some rezoning, looking at how we improve stormwater. So the plan change is hitting a number of different requirements in terms of both national direction, but also the context that the council is in. And so how does it give effect to that? It's providing development capacity or enabling development capacity. It's looking at the location of where development is occurring. It's thinking about what's required to have a well-functioning urban environment. And it's also focused on supporting Rangatane or Manawatu aspirations for urban development. So it has a number of key features. Intensification in some circumstances will no longer require a resource consent, and that's both residential and papakāinga as well. Marae are also more enabled within the zone than they currently are. When a consent is required, the assessment is much more focused. This is going to lead to lower regulatory costs, both for applicants, because they won't need to make the same number of applications that they do now, but also for council, because council won't be needing to process the same number of applications it does now. The testing that we've done shows that it's highly flexible for developers. So we've proposed an envelope of development. There are so many different ways that developers can respond to that envelope. And we have a suite of standards that set what we think that built form should be, the transport, the stormwater, coverage and the like. The intention is to have more climate resilient housing. We know that the climate is going to impact how we live, and so how can we think about future-proofing that? No significant unfunded infrastructure upgrades. So the technical assessments that have been done to support the plan change show that the upgrades that are required are currently in the long-term plan. And then we've got the introduction of a stormwater overlay around managing potential for flooding. So just a little bit on the roles in the plan change process. So myself, as the reporting planner, I'm the evaluative expert. I draw all of the threads together and work out what that picture should look like, how the jigsaw puzzle fits together. I've been responsible for drafting the new provisions, and I'll prepare expert evidence and respond to submissions and decide, well, how do we need to change things? Our technical experts provided the subject matter advice on the issues and recommendations, and I've drawn on that advice. And they'll also be preparing expert evidence in response to submissions. We've got you, our elected members, who decide whether or not the plan change is notified. We have submitters who participate in the process, whether they support or would like changes, and then we'll have the hearing commissioners who'll review those submissions, hear the evidence and decide what the final provisions should look like. So I thought it might be useful to briefly look at what's staying the same and what's changing. So there are things that will stay the same across the residential zone and the medium density residential zone. The type and scale of non-residential activities. We don't want to end up in a situation where one zone is more favourable than another residential zone for a non-residential activity. Parking and access design will stay the same unless there's no on-site car parking. So that's the only difference. The controls on development in the air noise contours and the existing ponding areas. It's important that we don't differentiate there. And then fencing, building height, sunlight access and setbacks. Whilst they're different from the majority of the zone, they are the same as in the Akoteri Greenfield residential area, which was assessed as part of Plan Change G last year. The list of things that is going to be different is somewhat larger. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but we no longer have a minimum lot size. We've got some intensification permitted, much more targeted assessment when consent is required. And I think it's important to recognise that the character of the zone, of the urban areas within the zone, is going to change over time. So there's been a shift from maintaining to looking at something different associated with increasing housing supply and choice. And the operative multi-unit housing provisions won't apply in the zone. So this table is also quite dense, and I'm not going to go through it line by line, but really this is showing how we've taken the medium density residential standards and modified them to be bespoke for Palmerston North, for the outcomes and the built form that we think is relevant for this city. And so we've looked at different height in relation to boundaries, so the sunlight access. We've looked at larger outdoor living areas. We've looked at some modifications to the glazing. And this really shows how we've taken that opportunity, that we don't have to do what do what the standards require across the board. And this slide is really an example of some of the work that has been done to underpin the standards in the plan. So the council's urban designer has looked at what the operative plan says, what the medium density standards said, and then what we think should be appropriate. And so there's quite a lot of rigour and evidence that's gone into determining what we think is the right set of provisions to be notified. So just briefly around the stormwater overlay, this is a change. There isn't an overlay in the plan at the moment. The purpose of the overlay is to trigger an assessment. There are sites within the overlay that may not require more than the minimum stormwater quantity attenuation that we've said should apply across the board. So that's attenuation devices, minimum areas of permeable surface and minimum floor areas. And those are things that council already requires in development in the current operative plan. But what this does is say, hey, before you develop, we actually want to check and make sure, do we need to do anything further? It does cover a large proportion of the zone. I think we need to be upfront about that. But it doesn't always mean that extra mitigation is going to be required. The feedback from Rangatane or Manawatu is really important. Not only is it legislated to go through that process, but it's part of the partnership that council has with Rangatane. And I'm really pleased to say that the feedback that we've had is that they're generally supportive. We've woven their feedback into drafting and had confirmation that they like provisions we've got in there. I think it's also important to say that there are outstanding issues that we can't resolve, and we haven't been able to resolve through this plan change. So house sites of significance are identified, recognised and protected. That will be addressed in a future plan change. The lack of information about the level of housing demand for Māori, for Rangatane, that will be addressed in the next version of the Housing and Business Needs Assessment. And then a concern that the requirement for the stormwater assessment is going to disincentivise development in Rangatane's community of interest. As I say, we do need to acknowledge the stormwater overlay will trigger a requirement for a consent. I think it's also important to acknowledge that that assessment may not require any further work, and there is a need at the moment to apply for a resource consent for all intensification. So whilst we are not enabling development across the entire zone, we are not necessarily making it harder than it currently is. And finally, council consulted on a draft of this plan change a couple of years ago. We've considered all of that feedback. We have made a change by reducing the number of units that could be built without a resource consent, and we've looked at what the built envelope should be and where the boundaries of the zone are. So that has all been taken into account. Quite a lot of the feedback did talk about changes in amenity and character, and the National Policy Statement for urban development is quite clear that a change in amenity because of increasing housing is not an adverse effect in and of itself. And so what we need to be looking at is what are the standards that we think are appropriate to create something that addresses amenity, but which doesn't prevent being able to build more houses. And then just thinking about what's next, assuming that council approves notifying the plan change, then we would notify, there would be a submission period, and then we'd have officers' reports, a hearing, and then there would be decisions. And so, look, it is a bit of a finger in the air. Well, we aren't able to be super specific as yet, but the estimate is we could have plan change operative 2026. It's very dependent on a whole lot of things happening first. But that gives you a bit of a flavour for the time frame that we're thinking about. So that's the end of the presentation.
Yeah, we're happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. We have got questions. Sorry about that, Mr. Mayor. We'll get you there.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Look, thanks, people. That was good summary. A couple of questions. I'll go from the start. So bearing in mind, and you summed it up really well, Jono, at the start, that going to the vision, this is quite a change, hasn't really worked in the past when we've tried to get developers to do things. Can I ask why we haven't looked at staging things a little bit? You know, we've gone to the, well, pretty well to the extremity of the borders of a density zone. Did you think about perhaps going a little bit smaller, trying to get some wins on the board, rather than carte blanche, which, you know, has been abused in the past by the likes of Clang-Order and others?
Look, I'll answer that, and if Sarah wants to fill in any gaps, she's quite welcome to. No, we didn't, and the reason we didn't is that the extent of the zone that we've identified actually doesn't meet our NPS requirements at the moment. So if we look at our obligations under the NPS, even this large extent of medium density zone that we've identified actually doesn't meet our current requirements. So if we were to stage it, we would be meeting them to a lesser extent than what we are at the moment.
Okay. As a Tier 2 city, though, we don't have to do this, do we?
So as a Tier 2 city, the council is required to do a plan change to give effect to the NPS for urban development. They are also required to enable heights and density that is commensurate with the greater of the level of accessibility to public or active transport or housing demand. So we've looked at the boundary of the zone based on accessibility. We did also look at whether we rezoned the entire residential zone to medium density, and we discounted that option primarily because of infrastructure. The other requirement that the direction requires is that the zone is infrastructure ready, which means there's either infrastructure capacity available or upgrades identified in the long-term plan, and we wouldn't have been able to see as infrastructure if we rezoned the entire zone as medium density.
So is that the only measure you use? It's just infrastructure? Do you not take what people actually think or want? Or?
In terms of the tests in the NPSUD, yes, those are the requirements, plan-enabled, infrastructure ready. The submission process then becomes the opportunity to test what we've proposed and say, well, community, what do you think about this?
Okay, interesting. Notification. My understanding is elected members don't normally decide that. Is this a slightly different process? Normally independent or officers decide whether it's notified or non-notified?
No, every plan change that we do, we have to come to this committee to ask for approval for notification.
Okay, all right. And the parking, can you just touch on the parking? So, will the parking be exactly as it is now, i.e. build 3 stories, can have 19 units and have 2 car parks? Is that what we're doing, or is there a change to that?
So the operative provisions in the district plan in the land transport chapter are applying also to the medium density residential zone. The only difference that we have proposed relates to a particular requirement around the widths of an access, because if someone's proposing a development without car parking, then those provisions aren't relevant. The vast majority of developments have car parking, and so they would be required to comply with the same requirements as are currently in the district plan.
Back to plain English, so it is currently as it is now. instance, a group of homes or units have been approved and built down Linton Street, and they have almost zero car parks. Is that what we're continuing with?
Yeah, look, with car parking, obviously we can't require it. So with existing development, we can't require it. Within the new zone, we can't require it. What we can require is where someone does want to provide it, then we have some requirements around width of access, manoeuvring areas on site. But currently with the existing development in the plan, or with this plan change, there's no ability for council to say you must provide car parking. It's entirely up to the market to determine.
So we can't say, look, you can put 100 units there and you can no car parks.
No, the last government changed that requirement, so no council in the entire country can require anybody or any business to provide car parking if they don't wish to.
Okay, so we can't make a localised decision on that?
No, central government has pretty much told the whole country all parking requirements and district plans had to be removed, and so there is no, I guess there is no authority there is no authority vested in us to actually require car parking anymore. It's been like that for a couple of years now.
Okay, I thought there'd been some changes signalled, but there's no, under your knowledge, there's no changes signalled from the minister.
Mr. Mayor, that's actually the fourth time you've asked that question now about car parking. I think it's fair that
okay, all right.
They can't change.
I'll leave it to comment, sorry.
Okay. No further questions, Mr. Mayor? If you had. Okay. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks for the report. Just a few questions. I suppose in terms of ability to submit on this, is anyone able to submit, or is it only people that are living within the zone?
So anybody is able to submit across New Zealand.
Right.
But yes, anybody is able to submit on the plan change. There is a requirement if you're a trade competitor to provide a little bit more information, but generally speaking, there is no limitation.
Maybe if I could just flesh that out just a little bit. Sorry, Councillor. So we have identified directly affected parties. So those parties will receive a letter specifically, and then there's a broader public notice and information on the website for the rest of the city to engage with the plan change if they wish to.
So would the directly affected parties be people living within the identified zone?
They would be both people that live within the identified zone, but also people surrounding that zone who may be affected in terms of visual effects and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So there was the pre-consultation and some, I don't know if you call it pre-consultation, whatever you call it, you've already had some public feedback on the plan and made some changes. Do you think that the changes that you've made will be sufficient for the public, or do you think that public might want more changes but then dilute our ability to provide additional housing? I don't know what's wrong with these mics today, through the plan change.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Well, look, that is something that we're going to have to wait and see and hear from the public. Look, there's going to be some people who think we've gone too far and enabled too much, and other people who think we haven't. I think the message that we're trying to give is that the Tier 1 controls were, in our view, leading to some really unfortunate outcomes in the metropolitans. What we've tried to do through height recession, for example, is to take some of those worst outcomes and soften them for this community. So look, it'll depend on the perspective of the individual, I think, and I wouldn't want to guess what that might be going forward.
Do you anticipate that it may be an answer to problems around housing affordability?
Yeah, look, I think some of the feedback that we've had through early consultation a couple of years ago, but through the, we also, this was part of the recently consulted on future development strategy, and certainly some parts of the community see medium density housing as an option for them in terms of first home ownership. So there is certainly a view amongst some of the community that this plan change may well provide that opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Harpiter.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Will you be specifically talking to developers in terms of consultation?
As part of preparing the plan change, we went out and spoke to various members of the development industry, both in the public sector and the private sector.
I'll just add to that also, Councillor. In addition to that, we've actually talked to some of the developer agents. So we've actually taken out the provisions and said to a couple of the agents, take these provisions and test them for us. And so I think probably more than any other plan change, we've had a lot of, I guess, feedback and conversation with the development community to make sure that what we're bringing forward here is actually viable. We haven't done that before. I think we'll probably, given some of the really good feedback we've had, we need to do it more often.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you, team. Just a question to the officers. So at the workshop you indicated you'd give elected members a bit of a steer as to how much influence we have over the plan at this stage. Is this plan where it's at today either take it or leave it? Either elected members totally agree or have to totally disagree, or is there any movement for change?
Yeah, look, I think there was a conversation around that at one of the drop-in sessions, and look, the planning provisions, when we go out for a plan change, whatever changes we make have to be evidence-based. So the package of technical reports we have provide that underlying evidence. Then the Section 32 looks at that evidence and brings it together. If a councillor wanted a specific change to the planning provisions, a couple of things I'd just say there is that one provision doesn't sit in isolation. You know, the height recession, the height, the site coverage, the landscaping coverage, the permeability coverage, the clear glazing, it all works together as a package. So by changing one provision, we would then have to go back and see how the rest of the package work together. If you wanted to make a change, you put that to the vote, potentially what we would have to do is go away and have a look at the Section 32 assessment and look at whether that change has merit when we look at the evidence. Then we'd have to come back to you and indicate as to whether that Section 32 assessment is in agreement with your change, or potentially we could come back to you and say the evidence shows that that change isn't justifiable, but that is an option open to you.
Thank you for that. My other question was around shading requirements. Last week there was some question raised about how they could be implemented. I just wondered if there was an update on council's thinking on that requirement.
So the shading standard was deliberately written so that it didn't force a particular response, and it left it open to an applicant to decide how they would do that. So the different options could be a tree, a brise soleil. Someone could decide that they wanted to put up a shade sail. They could put a small cover on an area. We didn't want to restrict the opportunity for developers to work out what the best way for them to respond was within the context of their own development.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And I guess my question there is to see some confusion in terms of how that's implemented, particularly if you were going through a resource consent process, then these requirements would be placed as consent conditions on the property. Given it won't be a consented process, how will you mitigate future activity? Say the builder puts a shade sail in and the person who buys it 2 years down the track removes it. How will this plan change respond to any kind of change, put shade to the side. It could be water attenuation, it could be an addition to a building, it could be anything like that. How will this plan change respond, given it won't be consent conditions, it'll be a permitted activity?
Look, I think when it comes to influence over development, you get one. Essentially, council gets one chance at influencing development and how it's provided, and there are always rules around how someone does that. In terms of whether ongoing compliance is met, one or two things. I mean, one is through our compliance officer, but there are in other cases where in 2 years' time someone doesn't comply, it's not something generally that council would follow up on unless someone complained about it. And look, there's a whole lot of provisions in the plan that do that. I'm thinking of signage as one of them. We've got a whole lot of signage provisions in the plan. I can go across the city now and point to you out dozens and dozens of signs that don't complain, that don't comply. Someone complains, and it doesn't get followed up on. I'm being blunt, that's probably comply.
Fair enough, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Zeba Bellin.
I'm here, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I just wanted to touch on your point of housing capacity, the targets there. And you know, at 2.11 that we need 142 new dwellings per year, that PCI won't get us to that target, but it will help. And then you say that the MRZ could provide at least 56 dwellings per year. So I'm just interested in your choice of the words "at least" there. Is that the rate of uptake that we reasonably expect, around 50 a year, at least?
It's a really interesting question, and it's quite challenging to answer that. The figures that we've got in terms of potential uptake are based on historic building consent data. We're really reliant on the market deciding whether or not they want to deliver under the proposal. So the calculations that we've done say to us, based on the information that we know, this is what we think could happen. The reason that we're talking about predicting and could provide is that the market could provide more. We're just not quite sure, because the market is the kind of mechanism for deciding that. So there's a little bit of a kind of look back, look forward lens that you place over it.
And so it could, by that token, could provide less.
It could, and the way that gets picked up is through the annual monitoring for the Housing and Business Needs Assessment. So that mechanism comes into play in terms of understanding the contribution that the MRZ, the medium density residential zone, plays to housing supply in the city. And I think we could also see more intensification through the residential zone as well. So this plan change is not preventing that from occurring in the residential zone. It's rather saying that there is additional housing that can be provided without a resource consent.
Sorry, Councillor, I might just flip out a little bit as well. So if you look at that number, annual number, just looking at that is a percentage of our 330 that we predict every year. So it's sort of saying roughly 17% of our total housing that we provide, that we expect to establish in the city every year. At the moment, based on the information we're saying, probably looking at about 17% of existing supply being provided through this plan change.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Are there punishments or timeframes for meeting these targets or not meeting these targets?
No, there aren't. The Housing and Business Needs Assessment process and the annual monitoring becomes the mechanism for seeing where things are at. There's no current requirement on the council to be zoning for 30 years supply, for example. I guess it becomes part of the community contract, I suppose, in terms of the role that the council has to play in terms of enabling housing supply and the options that it has in front of it to be able to support that.
Right, thank you. So it's really sort of helping us to track the uptake over time and how we perform against those targets.
Yeah, the housing and business needs process is your main mechanism for that, and that will feed in your building consents, because I mean, I'm sure as you all know, a developer will get a resource consent, but then they will also get a building consent. And so the building consent is the kind of on the ground measure for whether or not development is occurring. And that will enable you also to see what type of development is occurring. So is it single story detached dwellings, is it apartments or terraced housing or whatever? That data starts to flow through.
Thank you. I just had one more on stormwater, particularly that there are parts of the zone which aren't impacted by stormwater constraints currently. To what extent would medium density development contribute to those areas developing constraints?
Very good question, and really the raison d'etre of the stormwater overlay. So the stormwater overlay enables or would require an evaluation of not just whether the site itself might be subject to flooding, but whether intensification of the site would cause additional stormwater overland flows on other sites. So it's been purposefully designed to address both sides of that coin.
Thank you. And just finally, we were talking in our quarterly performance report this morning about Transport Measure 5, which we have, which relates to, or it might be housing rather, sorry, Housing Performance Measure 4, which states that land with the possibility of flood risk is not relied on for short-term land supply in the future development strategy until the risk is fully investigated and acceptable land use or engineering solutions have been identified. So what I'm interested here is, what are we defining as a fully investigated risk, noting that the stormwater assessment said this is a general indication and couldn't be relied on for site-specific flood risk? And, well, actually, let's just go with that first.
All right, I'll have a go at answering, and then I might need Jono to kind of step in as well. So Plan Change I is a medium-term proposition, and so we're really looking from 2026 onwards. The purpose of the stormwater overlay is to trigger that site-specific assessment. And I think we do need to be honest, if that site-specific assessment identifies an unacceptable risk from flooding, then resource consent is unlikely to be granted. So that would be the avenue for determining at that more granular level which camp does the site fall into. Does it fall into the, yep, we just need minimum mitigation? Does it fall into the, it's developable but we need some additional? Or does it fall into the, actually, there's just, it's not going to be cost effective or possible to mitigate the risk at this particular property? And we don't have the information available at the moment to be able to say now where they should be, hence providing this process within the plan change.
Thank you. So what sort of confidence at this stage could we or the public have in our proposed land use or engineering standards or conditions if we don't have that information at this time? How do we sufficient?
Look, I can respond to that. Look, whether you're a development within this proposed zone or you're a development outside the zone, when a building consent comes in or a land use consent comes in, that does get assessed already. So that risk gets assessed already. So we already, for example, look at what is the stormwater mitigation. We already look at setting a minimum floor level. So I guess my reply to that would be, this is probably just formalising it a bit more in the district plan rather than it being buried in a council process once you lodge a consent.
Right, thank you. And so we're just putting that puzzle together as we go, as consents come in and that gets triggered.
Yeah, look, one of the issues with managing this natural hazard is the information that we rely on and the response to mitigation in a greenfield area is very different to how we respond to it within the existing urban footprint. So I think, you know, if you're looking at a greenfield area, we're starting with a blank canvas, and so we can influence the response to a high degree. Whereas within the existing urban environment, we've got an existing stormwater model. That model models effects on an area-based basis. It's not so fine-grained that we can assess the effects on a site-specific basis. So we use that high-level information from the stormwater model, and then we just use, I guess, the engineering standards and just our experience around the city as applications come in to inform that final decision around mitigation.
Thank you. That is all from me. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Fitzgerald.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Hey, thanks, team. Appreciate the workshop the other day too, guys. Really appreciate it. Hi, Sarah. Sarah, you mentioned earlier on that part of designing the stormwater overlay areas for medium density across the whole city took into account the infrastructure capacity of the city. So, for example, where there is no stormwater overlay in a particular suburb, which is obviously not going to trigger a stormwater assessment, are you quite comfortable that the existing infrastructure will be able to support multiple dwellings going up?
So we've had assessments of wastewater, water and stormwater servicing, and so those assessments have informed the extent of the zone and the provisions that we have within the proposed plan change. The assessments have identified upgrades that are required to accommodate, sorry, I need to keep speaking into this, that are required to accommodate additional housing. Those assessments are identified in the long-term plan, and so the funding has already been, or the projects themselves have been identified. And then there will be small, as I understand it, there will be small upgrades that may be required over time that would be dealt with through the smaller existing LTP funding programs.
Wonderful. And that moves me on to my next question, which is around development contributions. Are still payable, whether it's a resource consent or a building consent, and they'll be assessed the same way that they are now?
Correct.
Okay. With regards to those infrastructure costs and upgrades, Sarah, whilst it's in the LTP already budgeted for, eventually 10 years down the track, it may fall back to the ratepayers again to either go back into an LTP, which could increase the rates. Where the 3 dwelling model can go up to 11 metres, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, this plan change I does not talk about 3 single level dwellings on a specific site.
It could. I mean, that could be how a developer wants to respond. The building envelope for the plan change as a permitted activity is up to 11 metres. It's not a minimum of 11 metres. So developers may still choose to do single story detached dwellings. Yep. Hopefully they'll decide to do apartments and terraced housing and that sort of thing as well. Sure. They're not required to. And this is why the change will happen over time. It won't be instantaneous. And this is part of the market responding to the opportunity of the plan change.
For sure. Team, how might what thought or consideration had been given to, I'll use an example of a 3-storey property that has 3 separate owners, and how that property is rated for the city?
Sorry, that's that's not my area of expertise. Maybe Steve Patterson could provide some a reply to that, but I certainly don't have that knowledge to be able to answer the question. Sorry. Would you like Steve to come up and answer that question, Councillor? Okay, thank you.
Steve, if you just hit the right-hand side, I believe. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
I don't have a lot to say, actually, to be honest. Councillor Steve Patterson, Strategy Manager Finance. The rating issue is that we're always looking at how rates, how the development's changing and what the nature is of residential units to see whether or not the system is remaining fair. I haven't given particular thought to the issue you raise at the moment.
Okay. Final question, Mr. Chair. Last year, I might have been this year actually, Jono, you held a series of public meetings with the development community. Have you considered doing those again around Plan Change I, i.e. you're the agents and the surveyors and certain developers?
We actually met with with a number of agents and members of the development community, both the public and the private sector, as part of developing the plan change. So that happened earlier this year, around August time, and that feedback then helped inform the response in the plan change.
Sure. So no plan to do more of that through the submission process or post the submission process?
Generally, once we publicly notify something, we just leave the process, and we generally don't do targeted conversations that way. What I would say is I'm presenting to the next Palmy Build Forum on industrial growth, but I was planning on using that as an opportunity just to make people aware that Plan Change I was being publicly notified, and that happy to have a conversation if they wanted to. So that's probably as far as we're looking at this stage.
Sure. And that question, Mr. Chair, was I think there are a number of elected members who weren't part of that consultation process that you just referred to, Sarah, and some of us might like to be part of it too, so we can actually hear from the people you're speaking to and understand what their comments and contributions might be. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So just following on from that, so this document's just shy of 800 odd pages, and appreciate that there's been consultation with agents and developers prior, but is there no opportunity to provide a public presentation, even like the drop-in centre with the additional information, and just have an opportunity? Is that why that might not be the usual business as usual? Is that still a possibility though?
Yeah, we're just having a conversation with Arcoms at the moment about a drop-in between now and Christmas. Not so much targeted at business, but just targeted at anyone who might have questions about the plan change. What we do have to be careful of is we can't be expressing an opinion on something. We can talk to people about, because we're in a formal process, we can't do anything that's going to undermine that process. So that conversation will be around how you can easily engage in the process, and also if people have questions about, for example, a rule in there, then we can have a conversation about that, but we can't express an opinion as to whether we think the height recession is appropriate or not, and it's going to provide, whether it will or won't create adverse effects on people. So we just got to be careful how we couch that process. So yes, there is some plans for a drop-in session.
Fantastic, thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. My question relates to the new requirement for one bike per residential unit that's required, and I'm just mindful of some people in our community with mobility restrictions, and I'm just wondering what the evidence is that supports the inclusion of that, and whether there's any scope for something broader that's more inclusive.
So when you're thinking about broader or more inclusive, would you be thinking about a standard around mobility parking as well, or are you more thinking about the ability to not have the cycle parking if someone is mobility impaired?
Well, either. It feels quite prescriptive, and it may not be applicable to everyone. So I'm just wondering really what the evidence is that's caused that to be included, and whether it's appropriate for all of our community.
So the evidence base relates to kind of two things. Firstly, the way that the zone has been shaped takes into account accessibility to active modes of transport, and that's both walking and cycling. One of the barriers for people being able to get on their bikes is having somewhere to store a bike at home. The way that we've crafted the requirement is not to say that the bike parking needs to be of a particular dimension or location or anything like that. So it could be inside a garage, which is what happens a lot of the time at the moment. The operative plan already requires cycle parking for business, for local business as well. And so this is thinking about start of trip as well as end of trip in terms of connecting people. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, occupants in a property will change over time. And so whilst someone in a property in one period of time may not have a need for a cycle park, a subsequent occupant might have that need. And so we're really trying to set the basic standard, I suppose, without wanting to remove the flexibility for how that's provided.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple questions here. Around the purpose, enable is the word that's used in the purpose. It's the first word there, to enable these good things to happen. Just looking at there's a number of changes proposed here. Is that a word sufficiently strong given all those changes? I'm thinking about, you know, kind of enabling, encouraging, ensuring, kind of a hierarchy of incentive.
So if I can just perhaps make sure I understand the link between enable and changes, are you maybe just able to elaborate a little bit more on that for me?
Sure, yeah, it probably builds a bit on the mayor's point that, you know, we've done some things before to enable, but there hasn't really been uptake. And Jono's point, you get one shot. It is enable kind of too passive in a way in terms of actually getting some outcomes.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So putting my planning speak hat on, my technical expert hat on, when we use enable, it refers to being able to undertake activities without a resource consent or with a consent that has to be granted. So in the context of PCI, when we're talking about enable, it's recognising that a bunch of development is going to be able to happen in the zone without a resource consent. There are more standards that would apply than are currently in the residential zone. A lot of those standards codify things that council is already doing at the moment. And when a resource consent is required, the assessment criteria are much narrower than are currently there. So if we think about how that enabling jigsaw puzzle fits together, the intention is that you can do things without a consent now. When you do need a consent, there's more certainty and more clarity about A, what it's required for, and B, how it's going to be assessed, and therefore the conditions that might apply to it. We tend to steer away from encourage because it can be quite hard to articulate what encourage means practically, which is why we tend to go for enable and provide. It's a bit of probably planning system jargon, really.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that insight. Quite a bit in here. The chair mentioned the length of the document. Some of that bundles in some council land, some of which has had a fair bit of contestation on it over the years in terms of community views, and just kind of wanted to get a handle on the rationale around kind of bundling some kind of public land, relatively contentious things like Huia Street in with kind of all the stuff that applies onto private land as well, and kind of doing it all at once. What's the rationale around that?
Well, I think the first part of that, responding to that question is we've had, from an officer point of view, you know, we've had a number of resolutions from council directing us, you know, to enable development of these sites. These sites sit within the zone because they are accessible. So it would be incredibly expensive and time consuming if we took these out and then put them into separate plan changes when, you know, both these sites that we're talking about, Summer Hayes and Huia Street, actually fit within the zone anyway. So yeah, just from a cost perspective and from a timeliness perspective, just thought it was better to bundle it in as part of this work.
Great, thank you. And just a couple quick questions around some of the changes and standards that were highlighted. There's no standard around the rear boundary, if I saw that correctly. I just wanted, like in terms of thinking about conversations with constituents in the foreseeable, just trying to understand, like, what would I say to them in terms of why what's the rationale?
Because when all of the other standards are put together, you will get houses off the rear boundary. So rather than going down the route of having a minimum requirement for a setback from the rear boundary, when you take into account permeable surface requirements, landscape requirements, the outdoor space, the outlook requirements, they actually force a building off the rear boundary already.
Great, thank you. That's now clear. The other one was just around permeability standards, and if we could just understand kind of what the status quo is and what is different in the proposal.
I probably can't talk to the status quo. I might direct that to Jono.
Look, in terms of current, the current district plan, there's very little requirement for permeability. In some of our more recently zoned land there is, but this is certainly probably the first in terms of a broad reaching plan change that's going to affect a significant amount of the city. It's probably the first time we've sort of applied it to a broad area, and obviously that's related to a whole lot of issues around water quality and also management of stormwater. So what I would say to you is that I think it's probably a signal to when we look at reviewing the residential zone in about 24 months' time, it's probably something that we're going to have to look at potentially applying residential in the city, I suspect, subject to the technical assessment.
Great, thank you all, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a couple of questions from me. Just in regards to the height in relationship to the boundary, and it mentions going from a 3-story down to 2 for the final third. Is that regardless of the sun orientation, that requirement?
Yes, it is. And the intention is to think about where the effects envelope lies. And so as we have more houses on a site, you're pushing the taller buildings to the front of the site, and you're enabling perhaps a more stepped or considered approach at the rear of the site. It's not necessarily going to prevent 3-story buildings at the rear. What it would do is require them to be more considered in terms of how they fit on that site.
Okay, thank you. And then just in regards to, you mentioned before that the permeable surface and all the sort of requirements about setback all are interlinked. Just around any opportunity for amendment at this point, can you give comment just practically for us to receive the recommendations, but if members did have in mind to make alterations at this point, is there a voice of concern around that, or can I just get some comment from officers?
Yeah, happy to do that. I think I may have addressed this issue earlier, but happy to repeat it. So if a councillor wishes to make a substantive change to, say, a rule, and take that to the and put forward a resolution, that is an option open to an elected member. What we would have to do is we probably couldn't publicly notify the plan change. We would actually have to go away, look at that change, and get our technical expert who works in that area to give some feedback on that. Have a look at this and amend the Section 32 assessment, and then we would have to decide based on evidence whether we could support that change or not. Bring that back into the chamber for that conversation. So if that was put forward, yeah, it's unlikely that we could move to public notification after this meeting.
Okay. There's no further questions. Thank you all, and everyone else that's been involved in this drafting of this document. It's significant, as I mentioned. It's just shy of 800 pages of evidence and the proposals, and appreciate again, wanted to reflect the value of the drop-in sessions that you provided for us as members. Thank you. I'm happy to move the recommendation before us that the committee approve the public consultation Palmerston North District Plan, proposed plan change I, increasing housing supply and choice, attachment 4, under clause 5, section 1 of the Resource Management Act 1991, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comments or debate. Mr. Mayor, the floor is yours.
Chair, just want to thank the team for pulling this together. I didn't get an opportunity to come and have a chat to you a little bit earlier, but look, I think it's good that we do go out for notification and ask the community and especially the sector what they're thinking. I will go to the parking because, you know, I was about to open 19 units with 2 car parks in Linton Street this week, and I can just see those things becoming a real issue for us. I appreciate it's embedded in law, but my understanding the current government is going to change that law. So we've just got to be careful that we're not setting up there's got to be a balance, and I agree we can't have 19 car parks, but we could perhaps have 7 in this case or something like that. We're just pushing people into some vulnerable people too, in this case, into some silly situations. So I'm happy to support this, and I look forward to seeing what our community thinks. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, firstly, I agree with the Mayor's previous comments. I think it's important that we recognise there is going to be significant community interest in this item and identify that early on. There will be significant debate, I suspect, around the fringes of these zones, particularly those who'd like to be in and aren't in, or those who want to be out and aren't out. So I suspect as individual elected members, we may see a number of people coming to us with concerns and complaints. So it's just important that we manage that process appropriately as it goes through notification, and then I believe to commissioners it then goes after that. I think it would be unfair to say that every councillor here agrees with everything in this plan. Obviously, there's going to be items that individual councillors might not particularly agree with, and there's certainly ones that I don't agree with, but elected members will be glad to hear I don't have any amendments coming forward to the plan. However, I think full stop, Councillor Fitzgerald, full stop. I think there will be some quite easy to identify issues that will come out of consultation. One will be around bike parking. It feels like social engineering when at the end of the day, if you've got a hallway, you can put a bike in it. If a person wants to buy a property, they can put a bike in. They'll buy a property, they can put a bike in. If a person doesn't want to, then they won't. So I can already foresee developers calling me up and calling the Mayor up and other councillors and saying, it's crazy, they're expecting us to design houses that have bike parks in them. What if the owner doesn't want that? You know, it's pretty easy to see that happening. So same, there'll be controversy around the shade requirements, potentially around planting standards, fencing and screening requirements. So I'm putting it on the table now. I'm not happy with all of those, but I'm not going to try and change anything today. But there are issues I'm sure that will come to us. I think it's also important in talking and communicating this to the public that we make it clear for those who don't have a development background or a planning background or anything like that, that when they see their whole neighbourhood encompassed in Plan Change I, and I've had an old lady say to me, well, William, does that mean that all my neighbours' houses can get torn down, they can all be 3-storey buildings? And no, that's not what it means. It means over time we'll see a transition in some levels of stock throughout the community. But it's important that when people see themselves surrounded by this, it does not mean that we're going to click our fingers and in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, suddenly all of your neighbours are going to be 3-storey housing. This is about enabling choice, not requiring a decision to be made. And the market will determine whether or not it's profitable, for example, to buy a house built in 2010, tear it down and build something else. Well, of course, that's not going to be a profitable exercise. So I think there's a lot of fear in the community that perhaps not necessarily isn't warranted, but we need to be careful how we alleviate that as we go through this process. On balance, I think this is in the interest of our community, and I will support this going to notification, and will be very interested to see what feedback comes back through that notification process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Look, I'm actually really glad that staff have brought this plan change to us, because there is a real need in the city for housing diversity of choice and of cost. And what this plan will do, if it goes through substantially as is it will actually make it easier for developers to understand what's going to be allowed and to build it without needing to go back and forth to get resource consent. So I think there's a potential here for some big advantage to the community. And as the officers have identified, it has to be balanced with the tension of not wanting, for the public, of wanting their amenity in their own neighbourhoods to be retained. But what I would say to elected members is trust the process here. This isn't like a typical council process. It's a planning process. And when it goes out for notification, anyone who wishes to can put a submission in, and then that will be weighed up by the hearing commissioners, along with the technical experts and the lead planner, and to see if the provisions need to be changed. So this isn't one of those situations where we do an ad hoc amendment during a council meeting. This is very much a planning process that's guided by evidence, and there's plenty of scope for anyone who has an opinion or some evidence to present to put that in. So let's allow the process to carry on through. There's no doubt that we do need more houses in Palmerston North, and we need more houses that are affordable and that are available to people who maybe don't have a car, or maybe do need to have no, smaller outside areas, or who have got cost pressures in being able to get into their first home. So I'm pleased to see it coming through, and I thank the officers and staff for the work that's gone into it. Thank you.
Thank you. The Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I agree with everything that was said prior to my 2 cents worth. I do thank the officers as well. It is an important cope-up, and undoubtedly, as Councillor Johnson had mentioned, we do need housing and we need variance within what we offer. And like what Councillor Wood had said, it's going to be important to hear the feedback that we get from that consultation once it goes out, and from the developers. I actually think we've got to keep in mind too, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to sort of think ahead and be solutions focused. In the workshops, workshop that I attended, I was really grateful for the fact that I was able to ask the question about the tree canopy. We know that it has an important ecological role, and shade and sheltering and so forth. Not to mention that it reduces stormwater runoff, something that we know quite well, and helps with prevent flooding. But we too know the importance of having a city whereby the streetscape, what's available for everyone in terms of, like, I go back to the tree canopy, making sure that that's integrated in with this would be my hope, that it enhances our urban environments and contributes to the well-being of a healthy city and its residents. So I'll leave it at that. But ngā mihi kia koutou. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. There's no further members wishing to speak, so I'll now invite a vote. That's passed unanimously, 15 votes for. We're going to move on to item 11 now, which is the elected members' expenditure for 23-24. I invite Scott Manser, the Manager of Finance, to present this item.
I'm making a real bit of popping back to this table today, aren't I? Talking to this item, the overall budget has remained favourable for the previous financial year. So that's in line with overall budget management for council and how different budget lines are used as a net operating perspective. So that's really pleasing to see. just probably to note that it is the previous financial year, so it's under the previous LTP. And as part of the new LTP, we have brought budgets into line with how they're actually being spent. So obviously the previous LTP was very much a COVID time spend, and we've made some changes in the budgets for the current and future financial years in line with actual expenditure trends for elected members' expenditure. Take the paper as read, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Open it up. Councillor Johnson.
I just have a question around what's in and what's out, I suppose. So if the travel for the mayor or an elected member is paid for by an external organisation, is that counted in the budget or is that not counted?
That's counted for in the budget because we report the expenditure side with the exception of the donations for the mayoral fund.
Okay, so how could we see how much of, say, a travel budget had been externally paid for?
I could go and get the detail, but it would involve going through all the revenue transactions to see if that has been paid for externally.
Okay, all right. Well, no, I'm not asking you to do that. I just was aware that some of the travel had been paid for externally and was wondering how much of it was.
Majority of those do end up out of the international relations budget rather than the mayor's office budget. So they're included in table 4, but not in any of the earlier tables.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you. It's, I suppose, a similar question. I have some trouble understanding, particularly taking table 2 as an example, what the headings mean. So, for example, training there, that seems like to be training for all elected members. So I'm assuming that's just training that is for the mayor or for the deputy mayor. And where, if that's just there, where are the training budgets that are for elected members?
That's a really good question. So this is for training that's not related to the mayor and his role as the mayor, if that makes sense.
No, that makes no sense at all.
Because the governance budgets cover elected member training and their role as elected members. So this is additional training over on top of that. Let's use a really outrageous example. Say the mayor wanted to go on project management training. That would be the kind of training that this training would cover.
Can we also get some additional comment? Our administrator would like to make comment.
I'm just going to make that a little bit more accurate, Scott. So when the mayor goes on a training, it comes from the mayor's office budget, so it's covered in table 2. Elected members other than the mayor who do training, that comes from the professional development budget that we have that sits in governance. So that's not reported here, that's what we report quarterly through the quarterly performance report.
And this is training to do with the mayor's role as the mayor?
This is any training by the mayor comes from the mayor's office budget. Training from all other 15 elected members comes from the governance budget.
Righto. That was a lot more complicated than I thought it was going to be. So, hesitate to ask, but what about hospitality? What does that look like?
In what way?
What does that budget cover that we call hospitality?
That's catering for events that the mayor runs through his budget. As you can see, there are additional budgets that are further below. So it's not the civic and citizenship ceremonies. It's hospitality related into meetings that the mayor's having to work on council business. It's hosting dignitaries and things like that as well.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Mr.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. A few questions from me. Just in terms of the elected member professional development budget, which someone's just said that comes from the governance budget, how much is that for the current year?
Off the top of my head, 37,000.
Okay, and I note that it's included in the quarterly report for each quarter. is it reported their whole year's activity anywhere?
Not at that level of detail, much like majority of other budgets. They're rolled up to the higher levels through the annual report and the activity summaries through the quarter report.
Okay, so has consideration been given, I mean, this report obviously has expense claims, which I'm presuming that will be a small part of the overall professional development budget. Has any consideration been given for an individual allocation to each elected member of a professional development budget as opposed to one bucket for everyone that perhaps some people might utilise more than others?
I'll take that one through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, some thinking has been done on that. The elected member development policy is up for review.
Oh, good. And when does that come to us?
It's a good question. I've worked on it twice and actually tabled it. So I haven't actually tabled it into my work program for the next financial year, but there's no reason why I can't start again. Yeah.
So if that was to happen soon, would we need to request it, or will it come to us?
I'll have a conversation with my bosses and see what we can do about tabling that.
Okay, thank you. And just moving on to the sensitive expenditure on table 4. Am I correct in understanding that the total sensitive expenditure is the sum of the 84 plus the 22, being 106,000 for the year?
Yes.
And some of those budgets, when you total them, for example, the hospitality budget is 53 or nearly 54,000. That's more than the hospitality budget on table 2. Does that relate to what you're talking about, where sometimes it comes out of other budgets, such as international relations?
Yes, yep, that's absolutely correct. So table 1 and 2 is solely the Mayor's budget. The tables 4 and 5 are all expenditure of those types across all budgets within council, most notably international relations and education, that piece.
Okay. And Scott, you mentioned that there's changes for the financial year because this was in the last LTP. So looking at table 2 and the budget, the total budget for, you've got the one for 22-23 and the one for 23-24. What is the total budget for Mayor Office for this current year?
I don't have that figure off the top of my head, which in hindsight probably wasn't the smartest move, but the allocation of budget between those 5 identified items and the other expenses has changed. I think the total budget, there is a small increase in line with a lot of other council budgets, but the allocation across the detail of the budget is predominantly what's changed through the LTP.
Okay, thank you. And just in terms of the approval process for the, I understand that the bottom part of that, the discretionary funds, I'm looking at the wrong page. Sorry, looking at page 116, the credit card expenses, am I correct in understanding that they are approved retrospectively by the Chair of Finance? So can I understand the approval process for the table 4?
I might pass that one over to Wade to answer that.
Yeah, through the chair, the approval process is as outlined in the delegations manual. So prior approval is comes through me. We have forms in place for staff and HQ that will fill out prior to travel and expenditure being undertaken. It comes across my desk for approval prior to it going ahead.
And can I just ask if the principles put out by the Office of Auditor General, particularly the ones around being moderate and conservative, is that considered in the approval process for that sensitive expenditure?
Through the chair, I don't have direct conversations with the Auditor General, but the finance team might. I understand that it's been looked over by Audit New Zealand and it's been in line with the policy that we have in place. As I understand it, the team might be able to comment on that.
Yep, I can add a little bit to that. Yes, that's correct. And the audit team do look particularly at the HQ and Mayor's Office expenditure every year, and they have found no issues in regards to that.
Okay, thank you. Just wrapping up. Just in table 2, the hospitality and travel and accommodation ones are fairly well over budget. I'm just wondering what the consideration is approval of expenses when the year's budget for those items are, you know, doubled or more or over budget.
So all of council's delegations are to a net budget, and the net budget is under budget. And I think I referenced in the quarter report, we prioritise spending across the different expenditure types. In this case, we've held back particularly the consultancy support to the Mayor and additional venue hire and things, where the team have done a really good job at keeping that expenditure down to enable the Mayor to complete his activities needed.
Okay, cool. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Scott. Just a kind of general question for me, but like table 1, 3 columns, the right-hand column has budgets for the last 3 years. Just how are those budgets set?
Via the chamber and the annual plan or LTP process.
So is it a separate line item that bundles together something and says this is the whole package?
Yes, so when we brought the LTP documentation through, we had quite a view of activity and sub-activity budgets. One of those was the Mayor's Office budget. So the publicised document is at a much higher level, but when we bring that through the chamber, and we'll be bringing that back through in December, it will have that detail of what makes up each of those lines.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Michelard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Scott. Just to clarify my understanding around this, there's the hospitality on table 2, hospitality for the Mayor budget. If we are to have a citizenship ceremony, for example, where does it fall into? Does it fall into that, in terms of like conference room, harrage, and beverages and food as well?
Yes, so the venue hire will come down into the other expenses, but the hospitality expense will show up in that hospitality line. It's based on expenditure type, not expenditure activity. That type.
And that includes other events like Anzac Day and that sort of thing? Oh, okay,
Yes.
cool.
We've got a couple of questions. When was the last time council business definition had been reviewed?
That one's for me, and I'm laughing because potentially Councillor Bowen can remember the date better than I can. It was the last time we reviewed the expenses policy, which was in this term of the council.
Okay, thank you. In the course of the mayoral and deputy mayor's expenses in the sensitive expenditure, has there been any occasions where there's been a decline for a request to travel at all?
Through the chair, no, not that I'm aware of. However, the Mayor and I do meet quite frequently, as you would expect, discussing about forward works, planning, what's coming up and those sorts of things. So we are kind of very aware of travels, what commitments are being made and what's happening across the course of the next, 1, 2, 3 months and those sorts of things coming up as well. There are times when I'm not around, I've got an acting in place or those sorts of things and that as well, but generally we're across where each other is at and which hasn't necessitated the need to decline requests as such.
Okay, thank you. And in regards to reporting, would it be problematic to have just a summary update on the quarterly report or something, just so we don't get the end of the year and then go, hey, what's happened here? Can we get a tracking report? Is that possible, Scott?
Yes, it is. The only caveat I just need to put there is particularly the credit cards, because of the nature of the timing of when we receive those. There might be some minor movements because we accrue the credit cards at the end of each quarter. But I don't see any reason why we couldn't append these tables to the quarter report as an additional appendix.
Great, thank you. There's no further questions, Scott. Thank you. I'm going to look to move the recommendations that the committee receive the memorandum titled Elected Members Expenditure 23-24 presented to the Strategy and Finance Committee on the 13th of November 24. Move that by the Deputy Chair. Just, I may speak first actually, just in regards to, I think that would be helpful to have that incorporated, and I don't believe that needs a recommendation per se, but have a commitment from the officers to actually have that brought forward. And I think that's a healthy way. I think that protects the Mayor, and I know the Mayor is very happy to have this information presented. There's confidence in it, so I'm not implying anything untowards, but what I think it does is safeguard us, just that we have our checks and balances in place where there's other delegations beyond what we have in place to have it reported. So that's my comments. Open it up if there's anyone else wanting to speak on this item. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, this is useful for this to come to us. My first observation is around elected member expenditure, which is right at the end. And it did occur to me that this is not always accessible to all elected members in a perhaps in an equitable way, and I think there is perhaps some merit in some reconsideration of how this is allocated, and so I look forward to what the governance might bring to us in that in the future. My observations of this, particularly around the sensitive expenditure, I have to acknowledge that I do have a level of discomfort around the level of increase of sensitive expenditure, particularly looking back at reports of the Mayor's expenses over the last 2 years, which has more than tripled in the last 2 years from 34,000 2 years ago, and bringing that up to 106,000. I do have some concerns around the level of increase. I think having that more regular reporting might assist this, but in looking at the Office of the Auditor General's recommendations around good practice, there's a principles-based approach where it does need to be moderate and conservative when viewed from the standpoint of the public. It includes considering whether the activity could be achieved at a lower cost. And at the moment, I don't have probably enough information for me to be confident that we're meeting that good practice guideline. So perhaps I'm probably just indicating that probably a little bit more scrutiny around perhaps the approval process and the reporting process is appropriate in this case. And just checking with you, Mr. Chair, was there any additional recommendations?
Yeah, thank you for inquiring. It's just been suggested by the Administrator because it's actually a policy document that actually reads all expenses, excluding cost of taxi, claimed by elected members are to be reported annually. That's in the policy. So what's been recommended is that we put a further recommendation that we have it reported quarterly, and then that will follow through and update the policy.
Okay, well, I'm happy to second that.
Okay, thank you. Let's carry on. Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. It seems strange just sitting here and listening to all the conversation. I must say it's somewhat different. Look, and I appreciate some, I'd have to say our office expenses have not gone up 3 times the amount, so just want to put that out there.
Just pause you there. Point of order. What's your point of order, Councillor Naylor? Oh, sorry. Let's do that.
Sorry, I'm just been misrepresented in the comments that have been made. I didn't say the office of the Mayor. I was talking about specifically the sensitive expenditure, which has gone up in those 2 years. So
okay.
Just to clarify.
I'll rephrase it. They haven't. The sensitive expenditure hasn't gone up three times. So I just.
We won't have a debate. There's 2 different conversations in the interpretation. I think one is the line items. We acknowledge they've gone up, hence the questioning. I think what the Mayor's talking about is in total global sum, and I think both 2 wrongs don't make a right, and you're both right in your
That's
own
okay.
view. So
it's just
We'll
Yeah.
accept that.
Thank
Carry
you,
on, the
Mr.
floor's
Chair.
yours.
Just difficult sitting here and listening to some of it, that's all. And not taking the totality. And look, can I say the tracking, absolutely with you around quarterly tracking. I get these figures when you get them, so I didn't get a chance to go through them. I did go through some of the expenditure lines, and there is some internal tracking which just needs to be tidied up. For instance, Local Government New Zealand zone, all the expenditure comes to me. It should go to governance. So there's been some anomalies there. There's some international relations budgets that come through the office, which I'd have to say probably need to stay in that swim lane as well. And then commercial and business. I'm fronting the city around advocacy at the moment, as you all well know, with two of our big projects, including logistics and transport. And sometimes you're a bit of a price taker when you need to go and speak to KiwiRail at the drop of a hat, or you need to do something which absolutely is imperative around advocacy for the city. So, look, there's the Duke of Edinburgh, there's the Community Christmas event, there's citizenships, there's civic awards. If I could just say to the officers, can you please put some context to that? Because I'm struggling with some of the just the one-liners around hospitality. Look, very happy to have all the information go out and be scrutinised, because there's nothing there to hide other than just I'm doing my job. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And in terms of the Mayor's comment, quite agree with more information would be helpful. And I think part of the mystery here is simply in having a more complete report. And, you know, we had a very direct answer from officers that, you know, we do have direct budget control over that on an annual basis. So if there were ever any concerns, we would be in a position to move. Not saying that there, in my view, are concerns at this point. The main reason that I decided to join the queue was that I was surprised to hear reference to perceived inequities around elected member access to opportunities, and just wanted to I guess say first, if those are substantiated, that's a significant concern, but I also haven't seen or been made aware of anything at all that would substantiate that. So if it is substantiated, then we definitely need a conversation. But to my awareness, there isn't anything that suggests any form of bias, inequity, exclusion, any of that kind of stuff. So just want that to be very clear for the record in terms of my understanding of matters as they sit. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hapata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say that my view is that governments do a very good job in telling us when courses are coming up and asking us to put our names forward. And I feel that we are given every opportunity to do that. So thank you, governance, for doing that. So I don't think we're given in any way not given that opportunity. So I just want to put that forward. So thank you, governance.
Councillor Johnson.
Well, it's not often that I have to jump in to defend the Mayor, but this is going to be one of those occasions. I am aware of cutbacks in the hospitality coming from the Mayor's budget. And so one example that I want to put before you is the Civic Honours Award, where we used to provide a nice dinner to the Civic Honours recipients, and that has been completely scaled back in order to save money. So I do think that more information might perhaps be helpful to allay some of the concerns that some elected members have about the hospitality budget, but my experience has been of cutbacks rather than things being more extravagant. I just concur with Councillor Barrett's comments around access to continuing professional development money. My experience has certainly been that where I've identified a course that I've thought would be helpful and I put my name in for it, that it's been approved and the money has been forthcoming. So I certainly haven't perceived any kind of inequity or favouritism around that. So I will add my voice to that too.
Councillor Micallard.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was actually going to remove myself from the line. Councillor Johnson has actually said what I was going to say. But definitely I agree with all the the comments that have been made earlier around giving more context around the reporting, because just having accommodation here or training doesn't really say much to the layperson out there. It makes it look like we're just, frivolously spending money on things that are probably not council related and that sort of thing. And also around the equity side of things or accessibility of courses. I haven't seen also any sort of exclusion or bias in terms of members or councillors wanting to attend certain courses. Usually when it's an email has been sent to all of us by the governance team, we've all have been given the opportunity to sort of put a hand up to attend some of those events or conferences. So I believe that the current actually system or the current allocation funding is actually working better rather than just having a certain amount of money being allocated to a certain councillor, because not all of us actually take opportunity of all those conferences. I think I've attended more conferences than any members this year, just because I felt like, that's something that was aligning with what I wanted to, with my professional development or professional journey, and I just put my hand up for it. So I just wanted to highlight on that. But overall, I think more context into the reporting will be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the direction of my questioning was about the transparency of the information in front of us, and particularly in those generic titles of things like hospitality and training. I do think it will be helpful to have a little bit more, as Councillor Micklad has said there, context that informs the read of this report, which is entitled Sensitive Expenditure. So you can expect there to be interest in that, and we've certainly seen that in other jurisdictions as well as here. So that was the direction of my questioning. As Councillor Barrett has alluded to, the budgets are in our hands. So that's not a discussion for this report. This is about bringing transparency to the process and the quantum of spend that goes on there. And this report is helpful in starting some of that conversation, but for me, sometimes causes more questions than answers. And I think that's been the direction of this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. My comments just in closing before we invite a vote is, as chair of this committee, I get to sign off on the credit card expenditures. And so I know that has some integrity around that, and I can declare that. But seeing that that's still the smaller part of some of these other budgets that are actually growing. And so when I saw the report come through the agenda meeting, I just thought, I think for our own benefit and just integrity and safeguards for the mayor, just to have that rounded up and reported on and more specifically, just to cover off, is in train now. And so I think that's a healthy way of looking after ourselves. No further speakers. There's two recommendations. So the additional one there, which was just for clarity, is to include the mayor and deputy mayor's expenses plus our own, be reported quarterly to the Strategy and Finance Committee or equivalent. So I'll put both together. That's passed 14 votes for with 1 abstention. That moves us on to item 12, deliberations of the draft dangerous, affected and insanitary policy 2024, and invite Peter Ridge, the senior policy analyst, to present. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You'll be gratified to hear I won't speak at length on this item. I'll take it as read.
Peter, maybe if you just move the mic closer, we'd appreciate that.
There we go. Is it better? Yeah. This work has been done by Lily Cato, who's recently gone on parental leave, so I'm not the expert here. I will do my best to answer questions. The report recommends 2 small tweaks to the policy following consultation. There's a tweak to the section on strategic alignment, and in addition for Te Whatu Ora to be notified when a building is identified as insanitary. None of the submitters asked to be heard at hearings.
So we're recommending that the policy be adopted with those two recommended changes.
Great, thank you, Peter. I'll open up if there are any questions. There have been none. Thank you very much. I'm happy to move all three recommendations before us. You can see them, they're the same as were circulated in the order paper. Look for a seconder. Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comments or debate. There being none, I'd like to invite a vote. That is passed unanimously, 14 votes for. I'd now like to re-invite you back to present your item 13, which is the draft waste management and minimisation bylaw approval for consultation. Again, Peter Ridge, our senior policy analyst. Floor is yours.
Should have just stayed put. Kia ora koutou. We're recommending the draft waste management and minimisation bylaw for approval for consultation. This piece of work has been on hold for a couple of years while we did some additional work. There was a report on regulatory controls, which we provided to the Sustainability Committee back in June last year. And then, of course, we were working on the Waste Management and Minimisation Plan, the WIMP, which was adopted in June of this year. So waiting for those pieces of work to be completed means we've been able to take the bylaw review and look at those objectives, particularly of the WIMP, in mind. Some of the changes we've proposed reflect the issues that came up through the waste assessment and the WIMP. The best example of this is the proposal to require, to enable councils rather, to require site waste management and minimisation plans to minimise the amount of construction and demolition waste going to landfill. So this acknowledges that construction and demolition waste has a significant impact on the city's rate of waste diversion, and it's a significant component of the waste going to landfill. So our proposed change aims to improve that outcome. What we've proposed in the draft bylaw is the ability for council to pass a resolution that would require a site waste management and minimisation plan to be submitted along with a consent application for building or demolition work. But before passing that resolution, the council would first consult, separately from this process, on the specific requirements. For instance, the threshold value for building or demolition work being proposed. We're borrowing to a certain extent from an example used in Wellington as a way of making this work. The reason for including it in the draft bylaw, though, is to signal that council will be taking steps to reduce the amount of construction and demolition waste going to landfill, but that we need to do further work before we bring it into effect. Some of the things that we still need to explore and understand are the impact that such a requirement would have on our building and demolition sector, and on our own teams, including the building and resource consent teams, the resource recovery team. And we also need to understand the capacity of the sector to receive and process building material that could be diverted from landfill. So we know that there is plans underway for a Class 2 landfill, which would take building and demolition waste. But we need to make sure that the infrastructure is in place before putting in a new requirement. We also need to understand the value of building work that would qualify and where that threshold should be set before we bring that into effect, because we don't want to set it too high and create an unwieldy burden. We don't want to set it too low though and possibly have unintended consequences in that direction. So if the council adopts the bylaw with this ability to pass a resolution requiring site waste management and minimisation plans, then as part of the implementation of the bylaw, we would undertake that further work, carry out a separate consultation process before advising council on the details of what that resolution would entail. Another change we proposed for the draft bylaw is reflecting one of the issues that came through the waste management and minimisation plan, and that's around events waste management. So we currently have provisions in our administration manual relating to events waste management, and generally they're working well. But in discussion with our events team, the resource recovery team, and with some feedback from event managers, we think there's scope to make some improvements. So, for instance, our current administration manual requires event organisers to take reasonable steps to encourage recycling opportunities, and they do. But our proposed wording would require the use of recyclable or reusable materials or serveware wherever possible. And we make it clear that we understand it isn't always possible, but wherever possible, this is a requirement now. We felt it was more appropriate in that sense to strengthen the mandate rather than take it so far that it becomes rigid and potentially discourages events. We've also strengthened requirements around collection and disposal of waste at events, including a requirement for sorting and recording the type and quantity of waste and recyclable material. So this helps our data collection and it emphasises the need for sorting prior to disposal. Again, many event organisers are already doing this. We wanted to strengthen the language in the bylaw to make that clearer. There are some other proposed changes. They're discussed in a bit more detail in attachment 2. I won't go through them all here, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Peter. Open it up. We do have questions. Councillor Bowen.
Easy one, I think, Peter. Just in the outline of community engagement, you talk about making the statement of proposal widely available. This is separate to following up with people already engaged, separate to iwi and mana whenua. How are you planning to do that? What does widely available mean?
That's how we typically make information available. It's on our website. It's at the Customer Service Centre and all of the community libraries and the Central Library as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Councillor Fitzgerald.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Peter. Hey, Peter, just on page 161, you reference construction and demolition waste, perhaps not requiring a waste minimisation management plan where building consent or consent is not required over a specific threshold. If I use the example of the old police station site, which we just partly demolished, we don't have a consent in place to do anything. Would that be an example of not requiring a plan?
I think that would be an example where we'd want to be doing more work to understand the impact. So I fully acknowledge what we provided in the bylaw is quite scant on detail.
Yeah.
One of the things we need to understand is the interactions between this new proposal and what we currently do. We'd want to understand all those details before we take any further forward.
Sure. Has any modelling been done, Peter, on what it might look like going forward to, does the council have the capacity in-house to manage this process, or would it be extended out to the sector?
No modelling done at the moment. Like I said, very high level at this stage. If there is support for this, and if it goes through consultation and there is still support for it, then we'll be doing further work to bring that back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Zubalan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Kia ora, Peter. Just noting that we've quite recently consulted on the WIMP and thinking of consultation fatigue, how are we differentiating in our comms between the WIMP and the bylaw in order to attract those submissions to come through?
So one of the things we're doing is describing this as kind of the next step. This is how we bring a lot of the things that we wanted to achieve in the WIMP into reality. We know that the bylaw, and this is true for a lot of our bylaws, they aren't as attractive to people as a lot of some of our other work. Policy is very sexy, we know. Bylaws less so. The work that we're doing here, though, is going to be quite targeted. So we're working very closely, for instance, with Environment Network Manawatu. We know that they will have a lot of interest in this bylaw, and we'll be providing opportunities for them and their associated groups to be involved.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Peter. I note that there's a recommendation to amend the wording in the administration manual so that the property owner can be charged for missing bins. If somebody has a bin stolen, now that we've got the tag system on the recycling bins, are we able to identify where that bin is rightfully from as a result?
I'll do my best to answer that. I wasn't expecting to be presenting quite so early, so Natasha's not here, but I think I can answer the question. So the tags that are on the bins are RFID, so they work in close proximity. If we were to recover a bin, then we can scan it, we can identify the property it belongs to, and yes, then we can obviously return it. The proposal in the bylaw, though, is we already have the ability to charge for a missing bin or a damaged bin. We tend not to, because a lot of the situations are beyond someone's control. But what we have noticed going through the data is that there are a small number of properties where it's unusually high. And in those situations, we wanted to make it clear that if we believe that there is a pattern of misuse or abuse of the bins, that we may be able to charge them for those bins that they're requesting above and beyond what we would consider acceptable.
Okay, but is there a risk that we might get into a situation where if they're going to be charged, that they simply steal someone else's bin? Do you see what I mean? If I live next to one of those houses, for example, what's to stop them stealing my bin?
At the moment, there's nothing to stop them, but if we found the bin, of course, then we can we identify through the tag and we can take action accordingly.
So when the bin's emptied, you're not reading the tag on it at that point, are you? To say, you know, this is the bin from number 17, not the bin from number 57.
No.
So is there a possible unintended consequence of doing this, that just more people end up getting their bins stolen to replace the ones that are being misused?
I think in theory, yes. I think what we've discovered through the data is the number of properties is relatively small. So we're dealing with a very small subset of properties where they're requesting, say, 3 bins in a year. If we were to identify that, what this provision does is gives the council the ability to impose a charge for that bin. If there was an ongoing issue and we suspected there was a risk of bin theft, we could monitor the situation more closely. And of course, the bylaw states that bins remain the property of council, so we can still take action in that regard as well.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Peter. Just wanted to ask about what information be provided to the community alongside this admittedly dry document. For instance, kind of demonstrate the extent to which construction demolition waste is part of our current waste footprint as a community.
So one of the advantages of doing this relatively soon after the consultation on the WIMP is we have access to good quality data, and a lot of the graphics that we used for the WIMP we're able to reuse here. So one of the things we can do is highlight, for instance, the impact of construction and demolition waste. We can show that as a reason for why we wanted to take action here. I think that would be an effective way.
Great, thank you. And just for clarity, when you say it's something that we can do, is that the same as something that we will do?
Well, I think the inclusion of the proposal in this draft bylaw is sending a signal. So this is the first time we've presented it to council here, so really interested in the feedback there. Going out to consultation, we are sending it as a council, we're sending a signal that this is where we want to go. And the intent of consultation is to get feedback from the community as to whether they support it as well.
Yeah, and I guess my specific question is whether some of those good recent data, infographics, etc., will be accompanying this into the community's hands so that they're reminded of why it has come to our attention.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. There's no further questions, Peter. Thank you for presenting this item. I'll move the recommendations before us. The committee agree for public consultation of the draft waste management and minimisation bylaw and administration as shown in attachment 1. I'll move it, seconded by the Deputy Chair, Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comments or debate. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Chair. Just to I think very much the context around it being a good follow-on from the previous planning processes is bang on, so it's very timely to go to the community with this. I do think it signals several important areas of change and ones that I look forward to hearing back from the community on in terms of their concerns and appetite. Most of for example, the construction demolition area, I think, is one that is quite ripe for consideration. Most of the evidence that's out there is that 40-ish%, so 4 tons out of every 10, 40 tons out of every 100 are construction demolition waste. There's significant contribution to landfill from that source, and if there's opportunities to address that, it would certainly be good to hear from the community around that. Likewise, strengthening our game in the event space, another good proposal. So really look forward to hearing the community's feedback on this, and commend staff and officers for the work done to prepare this to this stage.
Thank you. No further speakers wishing to make comment, so I'd like to invite a vote. This passed unanimously, 15 votes. That moves us to item 14, which is the Policy and Bylaw Work Programme 24 to 27, and invite Julie McDonald, our Manager for Strategy and Policy, to present.
Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora.
I brought a This report is just a brief outline of functions of the strategy and policy team. You'll see there are 4 functions described in this report, and the report's really just outlining the content of one of those functions. There are 2 attachments. The first is the work program over the 3 years, and the second is a reminder of our general policy process, but we're happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Open it up if there are any questions. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just one quick one from me. Just looking at the attachment 2 on page 239, that's got the circles. Is there at any time in the process where there's consideration of whether a policy is no longer required?
Yes, we certainly hope so. The 4th step really is the part where we would ask councillors to formally agree to proceed with a policy development process. So this is very much an idealised policy process. It's not usually quite so linear. But for example, if councillors agree to adopt a policy, they're without having done that initial work, they're pretty much jumping over that initial stage. Our encouragement is that we get to do that initial bit of work so that there is a deliberate moment where council agrees to proceed.
Sorry, I probably haven't worded that clear enough. What I mean is, if we've got an existing policy, is there any consideration of whether that policy is no longer required?
Yes, so every time we bring a policy report, usually if there's an options analysis, we talk about what it will mean if there isn't that policy or that bylaw. I mean, obviously some of these things we are required to have by law, but we will always talk about the opportunities council has to not have that policy in place.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Julie. Didn't see it in the report, but would be really interested to get some information around, for each of these policies, what level of resources available either for educational support around that policy in the community or for enforcement support. Is that information something that could be supplied to elected members?
It's actually very difficult, councillor, to know how to answer that question. What I've tried to outline in the report is that one of the things we've been addressing over time with our policy process is to make sure that we don't adopt and file, but rather adopt and implement. That's always going to be our purpose. It's a great deal more satisfying as officers to know that our work goes somewhere and that, you know, achieves some change that councillors are obviously wanting to see. So we do have a much more formalised process now where policies end up with an owner and an implementation plan, and that goes to SLT. Most policies, unless there's one designated officer, are much more distributed than that, so it's often very difficult to talk about the level of resourcing available. And obviously different policy topics, for example, policy in the waste area has with it activities that are to do with education. Obviously that's part of the activity. Whereas other policies, an example that's coming to you soon is the food security policy. There's not necessarily dedicated resource for that. So it will be a matter of working out through the implementation plan how that can be given effect to within existing resources probably.
Thank you. So listening to that answer and looking kind of at the short form version of it, it could either be a yes or a no. That kind of sounded like it was a pretty long no. Is that where you got to?
Always reluctant to be tied down to a yes or a no. I think it depends. That's my standard. It depends on the policy.
So what would be needed to, I guess, get some visibility around that?
It's probably something we would need to address through our implementation plan development process and something for SLT to consider and how budgets are constructed even. I don't know if Wade wants to comment on that, but we don't necessarily have, we often have an activity view of costs of things, whereas policies are often distributed across different activities of council. Sure, it's a no.
We'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Julie, Peter. I was just wondering where we've got both a policy and a bylaw, so as came up in the last item and also, say, with dog control and things like that, is there any advantage in aligning those pieces of work so that work on the policy review and the bylaw could be done simultaneously? Like, is that any kind of efficiency?
I think you gave some good examples there, Councillor. In the case of the waste management and minimisation plan, we did deliberately hold things back with the bylaw so that there's alignment. So the bylaw, for instance, was originally the review started in 2021, we held it back so that we could align it. And I think we try and make those kinds of decisions where it's appropriate. In the case of the dog control policy and the dog control bylaw, they're bound much more closely in legislation. There's a requirement to have a bylaw that is consistent with the policy. Outside of those two examples though, it will largely be a question of timing, I think, and sometimes the bylaws are driven by a statutory time frame to review them, and we may not have the resourcing to bring policy where it relates to the bylaw in advance of the bylaw.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no further questions. Thank you both. I'm happy to move the recommendation before us that the committee receive the report titled Policy and Bylaw Work Programme 24-27, presented to the Finance Committee 13th November 24, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open it up for any comments or debate. The Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Acknowledge Julie's team. Got a lot of policies there, 32 of them, and 8 are mandatory. But look, I just want to say, those that have been in the room as long as myself will remember we had a presentation and quite a number of workshops from the former CEO of Adelaide City, and one of his pet hates was bylaws and policies, and Adelaide City had literally hundreds of them, and it was slowing the city down. We've just got to be careful we don't get into that space as well. Look, I'm going to vote for this because I think there is some necessary work that needs doing, and even though they're not mandatory, things like alcohol, sun protection, naming policy. Strangely, Waters doesn't have a mandatory policy, which it probably should do. So look, I'm okay with that, but just be careful. We're creeping back into the space where we were 10 years ago, where we stripped out a whole lot of policies, a whole lot of bylaws, and they've come back in through the back door. So just a word of caution. Thank you.
Thank you. No further speakers wishing to make comment. I'd now like to invite a vote. That's passed unanimously, 14 votes for. That brings us to item 15. With respect, I'm not intending to invite the officers forward. As chair, I am going to refer this item to our first meeting of the new year, which is the 26th of February. For these reasons, there's been confirmed and a level of comfort from the CE, new information to date that needs to be evaluated to be put into an updated report. So that will be presented at the 26th of February meeting of this committee. That brings us to item 16 and 17, which is a combo of publicly notification occupancy leases, and welcome Bill Carswell to the table, who is our Manager for Property and Resource Recovery. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, councillors. Apologise for my undress, so it caught me on the hop coming back. The first two that I would present to you, I would take as read there. These two are for going to the public for consultation before a vote's actually taken.
Thank you, Bill. And that's namely the Manawatu Racing Pigeon Club Incorporated and also the Manawatu Woodworkers Guild Incorporated. Open it up to members for any questions on these two items. Thank you, Bill. There's no questions on that. So I'll move the series of recommendations, and again, I'm not intending to put them all out per se. They are a repeat of what's been in the agenda circulated publicly. I'll move them, seconded by Councillor Naylor, and invite any comments or debate. There is none, and therefore I'd invite a vote. That is passed unanimously, 15 votes for. That brings us to items 18 and 19, and again, welcome you, Bill, to present these two items.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These two, first one is Vortier, part of Vortier Park 916. It's to Red Sox, and the other one is to the Manawatu Radio Club, of which we also have a relationship. They play quite a major part in our CD response. Again, I ask that they be taken as read, and if you have any questions.
Thank you, Bill. Open it up to anyone who may have questions or queries. There being none, thank you, Bill. Appreciate you presenting these items. I'll move them. I'm not intending to read them out. They're the same that were in the agenda, repeated on screen, circulated publicly. Seconder, Councillor Naylor, and invites any comments or debate. There being none, I'd now like to invite a vote. That is passed unanimously, 15 votes for. That brings us to our work schedule, item 20, and there has been highlighted the dates that are in here, the quarterly performance reports for quarter 2 and quarter 3. Just the dates, and ask if our GM could update us on those items and any others.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so just picked up in here. Currently, the work schedule shows that the quarter 2 report will come in May. That will actually come in February, and the quarter 3 financial report will come in May, and in August, we're quarter 3 showing that will actually be quarter 4 that you'll see at that time.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions in regards to the work schedule? There being none, thank you. I'll move the recommendation that the Strategy and Finance Committee receive its work schedule dated November 24, seconded by the Deputy Chair, Councillor Naylor, and invite a vote. That is passed unanimously, 15 votes for. Thank you very much for your diligence and to work through that before we broke for lunch. And can I call on the Deputy Mayor to close us with karakia?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the elected members, officers, and public members of the public as well. Kua mutu pai a tātou hui mo tēnei wā. Our hui has finished for this moment. Manaaki tia ngā tangata katoa I konei, kia hoki pai atu ki a rātou kāinga. Look after everyone who's here today and their family and loved ones, and may they return home safely. Kia hoki mai anō out te wā e te kāna, so that we can return back here again when the time happens or is needed. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and that closes our meeting, and to the Mayor, to the next step.